This morning began the way most mornings do these days, with my daffodils asking if I'd slept well. "Not too bad," I murmured as I leaned out the window. Their golden faces turned toward me with concern. "Bit of a weird dream, though." I didn't elaborate, because flowers don't understand dreams. Their whole life is now a warm breeze and sun on their petals, a bumblebee landing a little too forcefully and buzzing off again. Still, they nodded as if they understood, and one of the tulips chimed in, "Breakfast fixes everything." I don't even like tulips, but I appreciated the sentiment. I shuffled to the kitchen and waved to the fridge. It was already humming a cheerful little tune, letting me know it was in a good mood and fully stocked. "Not the yogurt," it warned as I opened the door. "It's on its last legs." The milk piped up, "Oh, but I'm perfect for cereal." It was, of course. I said my thanks and poured myself a bowl, already half wondering what the neighbors would be up to today. The thing about this world is that everyone's thoughts are just out there. It's not invasive or awkward, somehow. It's more like passing by open windows and catching snippets of conversation. Mrs. Green across the street was silently cursing her cat for knocking over her coffee, while Mr. Patel next door was puzzling over the wordle. I was tempted to send the answer telepathically, but decided to let him work it out. I could hear the mailman's familiar, quiet mantra, 2 more streets, then lunch break, 2 more streets, as he headed up the block. Everyone's mind had its own rhythm, like tuning into different radio stations. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk. It's impossible to be in a bad mood when the world around you is so alive. The trees along the street bowed gently as I passed, their leaves rustling greetings that felt like the rustle of an old friend's hug. A squirrel darted past with a nut clutched in its tiny paws, pausing just long enough to tip its tail at me, a polite good morning in squirrel language. I waved back. Even the pavement under my sneakers seemed to hum faintly with contentment, glad to be doing its job of holding me up. At the park, the usual cast of characters was out enjoying the day. A couple on a bench were staring lovingly into each other's eyes, their silent thoughts weaving together like ribbons, impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. An old man was sitting by the pond, shaking his head as ducks argued over breadcrumbs. "Just like politicians," he muttered aloud. Though I'm fairly sure the ducks understood him, they quacked indignantly. A breeze swept through, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and the peculiar sensation that someone, somewhere, was laughing for no reason at all. That happens a lot here. Joy just pops up like dandelions in the cracks of the day. I felt it then, a lightness in my chest, a bubble of laughter I couldn't quite explain but didn't need to. As I walked home, I passed a man painting his fence, deep in thought about what to have for dinner. His paintbrush moved like it had its own mind, dipping and stroking in perfect rhythm. I wondered if it was the same for artists here, if their brushes or pens or instruments sometimes whispered suggestions to them. I made a mental note to ask someone about that. Back at my house, I sat on the porch swing, watching the late afternoon sunlight slant through the trees. A neighborhood cat that I'd never seen before padded up to me, jumped into my lap, and settled in as if we'd been friends for years. It didn't say anything, but its mind radiated a lazy warmth. "You're comfortable? I'm staying." I stroked its fur, and the purring seemed to sync up with the rhythm of my swing. For a while, we just sat there, me and the cat and the world gently buzzing around us. As the day wound down, I thought about how normal this all feels now, how quickly humans adapt, even to the extraordinary. The sky had turned a soft lavender, and the stars were already starting to peek out, one by one. I watched as they blinked on, each one accompanied by a faint, almost musical hum. "Welcome back," I whispered, though I knew they couldn't hear me. Or maybe they could. Who knows? When I finally went inside, the daffodils were waiting to say goodnight, their petals drooping slightly with the weight of the day. "Sweet dreams," they said, and for once, I thought I just might. So, here's my question. If you woke up in a world like this, where the strange is the new normal, how would you spend your day? It started like any other gray Tuesday. The kind where you hit snooze too many times, the coffee tastes slightly off, and the only plans you have are to count the hours until bed. My goal for the day was embarrassingly small. Pick up some dry cleaning, Maybe grab a sandwich from the deli down the street. Nothing spectacular. If anything, I was hoping for a few uneventful hours to scroll aimlessly on my phone before the cycle repeated the next day. But somehow, by the time I went to bed that night, I was staring at the ceiling, utterly unable to comprehend how my entire world had flipped into something out of a dream. It all started with the red scarf. I'd spotted it as I passed a thrift store window, the kind of place I normally ignore because I'm terrible at digging through racks of dusty clothes for hidden gems. But this scarf was striking, deep crimson, fringed at the edges, draped over a mannequin that looked far more sophisticated than anyone I'd seen in this sleepy part of town. Something about it practically hummed with significance. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but before I realized what I was doing, I'd pushed open the door and stepped inside. The bell above jingled cheerfully, and I caught the scent of lavender, old wood, and something else I couldn't place, like freshly turned soil after a rainstorm. A woman appeared behind the counter, smiling as though she'd been expecting me. Her hair was wild silver, tumbling around her shoulders like she'd just walked out of a fairy tale herself. "You have good taste," she said simply, gesturing toward the scarf before I'd even opened my mouth. Embarrassed, I stammered something about just looking, but she waved me forward like she wasn't having it. "That one's been waiting for the right person," she added mysteriously, and I half laughed, certain she was just trying to make a sale. Still, I reached for the scarf, felt the softness of it between my fingers, and before I knew it, I was walking back out into the chilly afternoon with it wrapped snugly around my neck. That's when the strange coincidences began. As I stepped onto the street, a flyer tumbled out of nowhere and stuck itself to my leg. "Gala on the Green," it read in bold, golden letters, with a photo of a stunning park lit up by twinkling fairy lights. It was apparently some kind of charity event happening just across town. Tonight? Normally, I'd never consider going to something so out of the blue, especially not alone. But for some reason, I kept holding that flyer, imagining what it might feel like to step into a place that beautiful, even for just a moment. After all, what else did I have planned? Nothing. So I decided, for once, to let the universe have its way with me. I went home and threw together the closest thing I had to formal wear. A plain black dress that had been gathering dust in the back of my closet, and a pair of heels I'd sworn I'd never wear again after they gave me blisters at my cousin's wedding. The scarf tied it all together. I still felt underdressed, but when I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. There was something in my eyes, an energy, an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. It was enough to propel me out the door and onto a bus that rattled toward the glowing lights of the park. The event itself looked like something plucked straight from a romantic comedy. Strings of lanterns hung from towering oaks, casting warm, golden pools of light over the crowd. People were laughing, swirling champagne, and nibbling on tiny, exquisite appetizers that waiters carried on silver trays. A string quartet played softly in the background, their music drifting through the crisp evening air. I lingered on the edges of the crowd, unsure of where to go or what to do, until a voice behind me said, "First time here." I turned and found myself face to face with a man who looked like he'd stepped out of one of those old black and white movies where everyone talked fast and dressed impeccably. He had sharp cheekbones, a slightly crooked tie, and the kind of easy smile that makes you feel like you've known someone for years. Before I could answer, he glanced at my scarf and said, "Well, you certainly look like you belong." It was such a small compliment, but it sent warmth flooding through me, and suddenly I wasn't just some awkward bystander. I was part of the magic. We talked for what felt like hours. His name was Julian, and he was impossibly charming in that way where you're not even sure if he's real. He told me he worked in the city, but missed the quiet of smaller places like this. I told him about my humdrum week and how I'd ended up here on a whim. He seemed delighted by the randomness of it all, laughing in a way that made me forget how ridiculous my story sounded. At some point, he offered me his arm, and we wandered through the park, weaving between couples dancing and children chasing bubbles that floated like tiny moons above the grass. The highlight of the night came when a photographer approached us and insisted on taking our picture. "For the newsletter," she explained. We both laughed, half protesting, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. As the flash went off, Julian leaned closer and whispered, guess we're officially part of the story now? The night ended too quickly, as perfect things always do. He walked me to the bus stop, and for a moment, I thought he might kiss me, but instead, he just smiled and said, "Until next time." It felt like a promise, though we both knew how rare second meetings are in stories like these. Still, as I rode home, scarf pulled tight against the cold, I couldn't stop smiling. I'd gone from a dreary, forgettable Tuesday to a night straight out of a dream, all because of a whim I couldn't explain. The next morning, I woke up half convinced it had all been a vivid hallucination. But then I saw it, tucked into the pages of the local paper someone had left on my doorstep. A photo of Julian and me, both mid-laugh, my scarf vivid against the sea of lantern light. The headline read, "A Night to Remember." So, have you ever had a day that felt like it was straight out of a storybook or an old movie? Something so perfect and unexpected that you almost couldn't believe it really happened? I never thought the meaning of life would hit me in a gas station bathroom at 2 a.m., but here we are. It started with a road trip I didn't even want to be on. My friend Pete had just gone through a breakup, the kind that leaves a person listening to sad indie playlists and using phrases like "finding myself" unironically. He called me up with a plan. Drive cross-country, no map, no GPS, just vibes. I said yes, partly because I'm a pushover and partly because I thought it would involve less crying than staying home with Pete. 2 days into this odyssey, we were somewhere in Nebraska, which is mostly corn and existential dread. Pete was asleep in the passenger seat, mouth open, snoring like a cartoon bear, and I was running on a toxic cocktail of gas station coffee and pure spite. Somewhere near mile marker who knows what, I felt my stomach do that ominous gurgle that can only mean one thing. I spotted a beacon of fluorescent light up ahead, a shabby gas station that looked like it hadn't passed a health inspection since the 90s. But desperate times, right? I parked, nudged Pete awake just enough for him to grunt something that sounded like meh, and stumbled inside. The bathroom was everything you'd expect, dimly lit, graffiti-covered, and emanating a smell that could have peeled paint. There was one stall, and it was occupied. So, I leaned against the sink, waiting for my moment of glory, and that's when I saw it. On the mirror, written in Sharpie, were the words, "You're exactly where you need to be." Now, if you've ever been awake at 2 a.m. in a questionable restroom, you'll understand that my first thought wasn't enlightenment. It was, who writes inspirational quotes in a gas station bathroom? My second thought was that they probably had way too much free time. But as I stood there, sleep-deprived and slightly nauseous, I couldn't stop staring at it. You're exactly where you need to be. It felt ironic, given that where I needed to be was absolutely not in that bathroom. But the longer I stood there, the more the words started to sink in, like they'd been waiting for me to find them. Life isn't exactly what you plan, is it? I didn't plan to be hauling Pete across the Midwest on an aimless journey of self-discovery. I didn't plan to feel stuck in a dead-end job or like I was failing adulthood because I didn't own throw pillows that matched my couch. And I sure didn't plan to find myself, of all places, here. Finally, the stall door creaked open, and out stepped a guy wearing a cowboy hat and Crocs, an outfit choice that raised more questions than it answered. He gave me a nod, like we were comrades in some unspoken struggle, and shuffled out. As I claimed the now-vacant stall, the words on the mirror kept buzzing in my head like a song I couldn't shake. When I got back to the car, Pete was awake, looking less like a sad indie protagonist and more like someone who'd been slapped in the face by a bag of chips, which he had been, apparently, when a bag fell from the overhead compartment during my absence. "You good?" he asked through a mouthful of Doritos. I thought about the mirror, the words, the absurdity of it all, and said, "Yeah, I think I am." The thing is, I didn't tell Pete about the bathroom epiphany. Not right away, anyway. It felt too delicate, like trying to explain a dream that made perfect sense until you said it out loud. But as the miles rolled by and the sun started to rise, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and pink, I realized something. For all the times I'd felt out of place, out of time, or just out of sync with the world, maybe, just maybe, I wasn't lost. Maybe I was exactly where I needed to be, even if where I needed to be involved bad coffee, Pete's endless playlists, and the occasional existential gurgle. We eventually pulled over at some scenic overlook in Colorado, and Pete was snapping pictures of rocks like they were the eighth wonder of the world. I sat on a boulder, sipping yet another cup of questionable coffee, and thought about how ridiculous life is. You can spend years searching for purpose in all the usual places: books, careers, relationships, only to find it scrawled on a bathroom mirror in the middle of nowhere. So, yeah, that's the story of how I accidentally stumbled onto the meaning of life in a gas station restroom. And maybe it wasn't the meaning of life, exactly. Maybe it was just one of those truths that feels profound when you're sleep-deprived and running on caffeine fumes. Either way, it stuck with me. Have you ever had a moment like that, where the universe smacks you upside the head with wisdom in the most unexpected place? Or is this just me, bonding with a bathroom mirror at 2 a.m.? There I was, standing in my kitchen, holding a single avocado in one hand and my phone in the other, marveling at the absurdity of it all. I had just spent 15 minutes scrolling through grocery delivery apps to decide which one could bring me this avocado in under an hour. Not a whole bag, not even a few extras to justify the delivery fee. Just one lone, perfectly ripe avocado. Why? Because I had already made toast, and without the avocado, the whole thing just felt incomplete. And as I stood there, watching the little progress bar on the app fill up as my lone fruit got picked, packed, and sent to my door, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. I mean, how did we get here? It wasn't just the avocado. It was the entire ritual. The fact that I'd spent more time agonizing over this delivery than I probably would have if I just walked to the store myself. But I didn't. Because why should I? Everything in life now has a shortcut. Need an avocado? App it. Want to know the weather? Just ask your smart speaker. Craving sushi at 2 a.m.? A guy on a bike will bring it to your door faster than you can say, extra wasabi. There's no room for effort anymore. And yet, somehow, all these tiny conveniences don't make life feel smaller. They make it feel ridiculously intricate, like we've constructed a web of tiny luxuries that weaves through every part of our day. I thought about this as I watched my delivery driver approach on the map, his little dot inching closer to my apartment. It felt like a video game. There's me, the protagonist, safely at home. There's him, the NPC, dutifully moving my avocado through the labyrinthine streets of the city. A single banana icon sat in the corner of the screen like a prize. All that was missing was some triumphant fanfare when he finally arrived. And when he did, I was so embarrassed about my one-item order that I opened the door with an apologetic smile and mumbled something like, "It's been one of those days." He nodded like he'd heard it all before. Maybe he had. Later, as I sliced the avocado and plated my absurdly well-styled toast, because naturally, I had to take a picture for Instagram, I realized how much joy these little absurdities bring me. It's not just the avocado. It's the whole performance. The scrolling, the ordering, the waiting, the photo. It's this dance we all do now, full of tiny, modern rituals that would make no sense to anyone living 20 years ago. And it's not just about food either. It's the memes we send instead of meaningful texts. The way a random GIF can communicate more emotion than an entire paragraph. It's the fact that I have a group chat with my friends where we haven't said a single serious thing in months, but I feel closer to them than ever. It's the way I'll scroll through TikTok for an hour, not because I'm bored, but because I want to feel connected to the hilarious chaos of it all. There's something so endearing about the little ways technology has shaped our daily lives. Like, take notifications. Who decided that we need to be gently buzzed every time someone likes our post? And why does it feel so good? It's like a tiny hug from the universe, even though I know it's just my brain tricking me into thinking I'm popular. Or think about online shopping. Not long ago, ordering something meant waiting weeks for delivery, but now I can have a pair of socks delivered tomorrow morning if I really wanted to. Socks. And when they arrive, I'm disproportionately happy about it, as if I've just achieved something significant. But it's not just the conveniences, it's the quirks too. Like how every app now has to congratulate you for doing the bare minimum. You drank water today. Great job. My fitness tracker tells me, as if I've unlocked some kind of life achievement. Or how my grocery app sends me a notification to say, you saved $1.12 on your last order, as though I've single-handedly solved inflation. It's ridiculous, but it's also kind of sweet. It's like the world is trying to be my cheerleader, even if the compliments are a bit hollow. And honestly, I don't mind it. Sometimes, those little wins are enough to make the day feel a bit brighter. And then there's the memes. Oh, the memes. I sometimes wonder what future historians will make of them. Entire generations communicating in inside jokes, emojis, and distorted pictures of Shrek. It's wild to think about how something so fleeting, an image, a phrase, a funny video, can bring people together. I've had entire friendships blossom out of nothing more than a shared appreciation for a dumb meme. It's not deep, but it's real. And in a world that often feels overwhelming, those little bursts of shared laughter are like oxygen. Even the weird stuff makes me smile. Like how I've started naming my Roomba as if it's a pet, or how my smartwatch scolds me for sitting too long, as if it's my stern but caring mother. Or the way my phone somehow knows when I'm hungry and starts showing me ads for takeout before I've even decided what I want. It's creepy, sure, but also kind of amazing. We're living in a sci-fi movie, and most of the time we don't even notice. So, as I finished my toast and scrolled back through my camera roll to pick the best shot, because obviously, I had to add the right filter, I couldn't stop smiling. Life has become this strange, beautiful blend of ridiculous and convenient, and I kind of love it. Sure, it's a little over the top, and maybe we rely on these things a bit too much. But it's also fun. It's playful. It's human. And that got me thinking. What little thing in today's world makes you smile, even if it's a bit quirky? There's this odd little feeling that sneaks up on me sometimes, like a soft knock on the door of my memory. It usually comes when I'm doing something completely ordinary, washing the dishes, driving to work, folding laundry, and suddenly I'm back there. Back to a moment that doesn't seem particularly important on paper, but is etched into me so deeply it feels like flipping through an old photo album. The kind where the edges are a little worn, but the pictures are vivid, alive. Like those long summer evenings when I was maybe 10 or 11, and the days stretched on forever. We didn't have phones back then, at least not the kind that kept you glued to a screen. The most high-tech thing I had was a little handheld radio, the kind you had to twist the antenna just right to pick up a decent station. My friends and I would ride our bikes to the end of the cul-de-sac, where the pavement gave way to a patch of scrubby woods that seemed enormous at the time. We called it the fort, like it was some grand hideout. But really it was just a circle of trees with a few boards nailed together to make something that vaguely resembled a clubhouse. It didn't matter, though. To us, it was a castle, a battleground, a pirate ship. We were anything we wanted to be. We'd stay out there until the sun dipped low and the streetlights started humming awake. That was the signal to head home, but none of us ever wanted to leave right away. Instead, we'd sit on the edge of the sidewalk, legs splayed out into the street, drinking warm soda from cans we'd smuggled out of someone's garage fridge. There was always this one kid, Tommy, who could burp the entire alphabet. I remember laughing so hard I thought I'd throw up, tears streaming down my face, while someone else egged him on to try it backward. It was dumb and perfect and so good it makes my chest ache a little to think about. Then there were the Friday nights. The best ones always started with a trip to the video rental store. Do you remember those? The way the carpet smelled faintly of popcorn and plastic, the aisles of clamshell VHS tapes with their faded covers, promising adventures and explosions and laughs. My parents would let me pick one, just one, and I'd spend what felt like hours deliberating. Did I want something funny or something scary? Would I go for the same movie I'd already rented 3 times? Or try something new and risk being disappointed? Once the decision was made, I'd clutch that tape like it was treasure all the way home. We'd make a whole event out of it. Pizza from the greasy little place down the road, the one that always had flower handprints on the counter, and enough soda to keep us buzzing until midnight. My mom would microwave popcorn in one of those orange bowls that got hotter than the popcorn itself, and my dad would dim the lights, which made it feel like we were in an actual theater. I can still hear the whir of the VHS player, the way it clicked when you hit play, and the faintly distorted sound of the opening credits. The whole house felt like it was wrapped in a soft blanket, and for a few hours, the rest of the world didn't matter. School was another kind of world altogether. Looking back, I can't decide if I loved it or just tolerated it, but there's something about the rhythm of it that I miss. Like the way you'd wait for a friend by their locker after the last bell, your backpack slung over one shoulder, making plans to meet up at the skate park or the strip mall where nobody ever actually bought anything. We'd hang out at the food court, splitting a single pretzel between three of us because we'd already spent our allowance on arcade tokens. There was this one winter, maybe 7th grade, when a huge snowstorm blew in overnight and canceled school for 3 whole days. The roads were a mess and everything shut down, but to us, it was magic. My best friend and I spent hours sledding down the big hill by his house, our jeans soaked and our faces raw from the cold, until his mom called us in for hot chocolate. She made the real kind, on the stove, with milk and cocoa powder and a pinch of salt, and we drank it sitting cross-legged on the floor by the heating vent, steam fogging up the windows. I don't think I've ever had hot chocolate that tasted quite like that since. Even the little things, the completely unremarkable moments, stick with me. Like walking home from school in the fall, when the air smelled sharp and smoky and the leaves crunched underfoot. Or sitting on the floor of my room with a stack of CDs, trying to make the perfect mix for a friend's birthday party. Or the way it felt to dial someone's number on a landline, the rotary clicking under your fingers if you were lucky enough to have one of those old-school phones. And then the thrill of hearing their voice on the other end, like magic, even though it was just technology. I think about all of this sometimes, not in a sad way exactly, but with this quiet longing. Like I want to reach out and touch those moments, hold them in my hands for just a little while. They're still there, in a way, tucked into the corners of my mind like treasures in a dusty attic. And every once in a while, I like to take them out, turn them over, and let myself feel how warm and bright they are. It's like visiting an old friend you haven't seen in years, one who doesn't need you to explain yourself because they already know. What about you? What little thing from the past always brings a smile to your face when you remember it? I'll never forget the time a squirrel taught me about responsibility. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but bear with me. This was a few years ago when I was living in this tiny studio apartment that came with a lot of quirks, as the landlord lovingly called them. The window by the kitchen didn't close all the way, which was fine most of the year, but it was fall, and the colder it got, the more I regretted telling myself, I'll deal with it later. Anyway, one crisp Saturday morning, I was standing in my kitchen trying to decide if I was responsible enough to make pancakes or if I should just microwave some leftover pizza when I heard this weird scratching sound. It wasn't the usual apartment noises, pipes clanging, neighbors yelling about whose turn it was to buy toilet paper, stuff like that. No, this was deliberate. I froze. My brain, like any logical person's, immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. This is how I die. Some raccoon's about to mug me for my box of Cheerios. I grabbed the nearest weapon-like object, which, sadly, was a whisk, and started investigating. That's when I saw him, a squirrel. But not just any squirrel. This one had swagger. He was perched on the windowsill like he owned the place, holding a half-eaten slice of bread in his tiny hands. When our eyes met, I swear he smirked at me. He didn't even flinch when I shouted, "Hey!" Instead, he hopped onto my counter, flicked his tail, and started sniffing around like he was on some kind of gourmet food tour. Now, I had two choices. I could freak out and try to chase him out with the whisk, or I could try to calmly guide him back outside without burning the place down. Being the adult that I am, a chronic overthinker, I spent a solid 30 seconds debating my options. Unfortunately, Mr. Squirrel decided to speed things up by jumping straight into my bowl of bananas, knocking one onto the floor. At that point, the pizza in the microwave plan was starting to sound more reasonable. I slowly approached him, talking in this overly soothing tone like I was trying to defuse a bomb. "All right, buddy, let's not make this weird. You just, head back out the way you came, and we'll forget this ever happened, okay?" He stared at me for a moment like he was considering it, then took a bite out of one of my bananas and darted onto the floor. And this is where things took a turn. Instead of bolting for the window, the little guy started running laps around the apartment. I tried blocking him with the whisk, which turned out to be useless because, spoiler alert, squirrels are fast. At one point, he climbed onto my couch, which was older than me and held together with duct tape and sheer optimism, and started digging into the cushions like he was searching for buried treasure. I'll admit, I panicked. I tried to grab him with an empty grocery bag, which resulted in him leaping onto the bookshelf, knocking over a framed picture of my mom. Eventually, I managed to shoo him toward the window using a broom and some colorful language. He hesitated for a second, as if to say, "This isn't over," and then he was gone. I slammed the window shut as much as it could shut and leaned against it, heart pounding. The kitchen looked like a tiny hurricane had passed through. There was bread on the counter, a banana on the floor, and one very smug squirrel probably laughing at me from the tree outside. You'd think the story ends there, right? No. A few days later, I came home to find another slice of bread on the windowsill. Not inside, thankfully, but definitely placed there deliberately. I don't know if it was a peace offering or some kind of squirrel mafia warning, but I decided to take it as a sign. I marched over to the hardware store, bought some weather stripping, and finally fixed the stupid window. It wasn't pretty, and I might have stapled my sleeve to the frame at one point, but it got the job done. No more squirrel break-ins, no more wildlife snack raids. Here's the thing, though. That ridiculous squirrel taught me something I probably needed to learn. The little stuff you put off has a way of becoming a big deal if you don't deal with it. I mean, how many times had I told myself, "Oh, I'll fix that window later," or "I'll clean that shelf next week," only to regret it when something like this happened? Turns out, later isn't a great strategy when you're an adult. Who knew? So now I try, emphasis on try, to tackle the little stuff before it spirals into a full-blown squirrel situation. Sometimes it works, sometimes I still end up eating pizza for breakfast because I can't be bothered to make pancakes. But hey, progress is progress, right? What about you? Ever have one of those small, random moments that ended up teaching you a big life lesson? Or maybe just a funny story involving wildlife? Either way, I'm all ears. Rain clung to the windshield like a lover unwilling to let go. Henry squinted through the blur of city lights bleeding into one another, the street lamps casting an eerie halo over the deserted avenue. His thoughts raced faster than his old Ford's wipers could clear the view, a cacophony of unresolved regrets and the biting sting of what-ifs. He hadn't meant for things to end the way they had. Or maybe he had, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The diner was still open, its neon sign flickering like an old man's heartbeat. He parked in the lot, its emptiness amplifying the strange stillness of the evening. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and fried onions. A waitress, the kind who wore her hair in a messy bun and her exhaustion like a badge of honor, waved him to a booth without much interest. Henry slid into the booth, the vinyl seat sticking to his damp jeans. Across from him, a laminated menu sat propped up against the salt shaker. He didn't need to read it. He already knew he'd order the same thing he always did: a black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. This place was his haven on nights like these when the weight of his solitude threatened to crush him. He pretended not to notice the flicker of recognition in the waitress's eyes when she took his order. The coffee arrived before he could drown too deep in his thoughts. It was as bitter as the memories he tried to suppress. The pie followed, its vibrant red filling oozing from beneath the flaky crust like a wound refusing to heal. He picked at it absent-mindedly, his appetite ebbing and flowing with the tide of his guilt. Across the diner, the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new arrival. He glanced up out of reflex and saw her. Emily. She hadn't changed much. Same wild curls, same piercing gaze that seemed to cut through people's defenses like a scalpel. But she wasn't alone. A man trailed behind her, his arm brushing against hers in that casual way that spoke of familiarity and comfort. Henry felt a pang in his chest, sharp and sudden, like the edge of a broken mirror. He ducked his head, suddenly fascinated by the half-eaten pie on his plate. Of all the diners in all the cities, she had to walk into this one. He debated leaving, but his legs felt glued to the booth. He didn't want her to see him like this, half-drenched, weary, and wallowing in self-pity. But fate, cruel mistress that she was, had other plans. Emily's laughter rang out, light and melodic, cutting through the diner's stale ambience. He chanced another glance and caught her looking his way. Their eyes locked for a moment too long. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something softer, more uncertain. She said something to the man, who nodded before heading to the counter. Then, as if pulled by an invisible string, she made her way toward him. "Henry," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and caution. "I thought it might be you." He forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Emily, it's been a while." She slid into the booth across from him without asking, her presence filling the space with an energy he'd tried to forget. Up close, he noticed the faint lines around her eyes, the kind that only came from laughter or heartbreak. He wasn't sure which applied to her now. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of the table as if searching for something tangible to hold on to. "Same," he replied, his voice heavier than he intended. "Guess the universe has a sense of humor." A silence fell between them, thick and uncomfortable, like a sweater 2 sizes too small. She broke it first. "How have you been?" she asked, her tone careful, as though she were navigating a minefield. "Surviving," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "You?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the man at the counter. "I'm good. Really good, actually." The words stung more than they should have. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The man returned with 2 mugs of tea and set one in front of Emily. He glanced at Henry, offering a polite but detached smile before walking back to their table. "I should get back," Emily said, rising from the booth. "It was good seeing you." "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You too." And just like that, she was gone, her laughter trailing behind her like a ghost. Henry sat there for a long time after, the coffee in his mug growing cold. He didn't finish the pie. When he finally left the diner, the rain had stopped, but the city felt emptier than before. I was standing in the kitchen the other day, staring at a jar of peanut butter like it had just insulted my mother. The jar wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting there all smug on the counter next to a loaf of bread, waiting for me to make a sandwich. But for some reason, I was paralyzed. This happens sometimes. I'll get caught up in the weirdest mental loops about nothing, and suddenly, the simplest tasks feel like solving a riddle with no answer. Do I want peanut butter and jelly, or just peanut butter? What kind of person am I if I skip jelly? Is jelly even necessary? It's sweet, sure, but do I need it? And if I do, am I choosing jelly because I like it, or because I've been conditioned to think it's the right thing to do? You see what I mean? This is the stuff that happens in my brain. Anyway, I eventually snapped out of it because, well, hunger wins over existential sandwich crises every time. I grabbed a knife, opened the jar, and immediately noticed something horrifying. The peanut butter was down to the last stubborn streaks clinging to the sides. You know the kind. Just enough to make half a sandwich if you scrape it aggressively, but not enough to do it gracefully. It was basically begging me to give up, and I almost did. I thought, I'll just make toast instead. But then, because apparently, I'm incapable of letting things go, I decided to scrape the jar. Not just scrape, but scrape properly, like a stubborn archaeologist digging for treasure in the ruins of my own procrastination. I got into it. Into it. Angling the knife just right, spinning the jar, maneuvering the blade to catch every last bit of peanut butter. It wasn't even about the sandwich anymore. It was about principle. I'd already committed, and there was no turning back. 5 minutes of careful scraping later, I stood victorious. I'd conquered the jar and had enough peanut butter to slap together a very questionable sandwich that was 70% bread. Honestly, it looked pathetic, but as I stood there, knife in hand, crumbs on the counter, I had this sudden, dumb little realization that stopped me in my tracks. Life is kinda like scraping a jar of peanut butter. I know that sounds ridiculous, but hear me out. There's this tendency, at least in my life, to give up on the small, annoying stuff because it feels like it doesn't matter. Why bother scraping the jar when I can just open a new one, or eat something else? But the truth is, the small stuff is kind of all there is. Most days aren't filled with grand epiphanies or life-altering decisions. Most days are just us, trying to scrape a little more out of what's in front of us, making the best sandwich we can with what we've got. And sometimes it looks a little sad, sure. Sometimes it's a half-hearted attempt, and sometimes it's downright messy. But at the end of the day, you're still fed. You still showed up. I took a bite of that sandwich, expecting it to taste like regret and unfulfilled potential. But you know what? It wasn't bad. It was fine. Good. Even. And I realized something else, standing there in my kitchen, chewing my mediocre sandwich. I spend way too much time waiting for the big stuff to happen, waiting to feel motivated or inspired, or like I've finally figured things out. But maybe life isn't about waiting for the perfect moment to open a fresh jar. Maybe it's about scraping the jar you've got, even when it's annoying or feels pointless, because every little effort adds up to something, even if it's just a sandwich. The best part? After I finished eating, I found a brand new jar of peanut butter sitting in the back of the pantry. I could have used it all along. I laughed out loud, standing there with peanut butter on my fingers, because of course that's how it works. You struggle and scrape and fight for something, and the moment you finally make peace with it, the thing you wanted all along reveals itself. Classic life move. I didn't feel bitter about it though. If anything, I felt kinda grateful. Like I needed the stupid effort to appreciate the ease. The new jar was just the cherry on top, or, I guess, the jelly. Anyway, that's my peanut butter story. I know it's not much, but it stuck with me. I guess I'm curious now. What's the last small, silly thing you did that ended up teaching you more than you expected? The other day, I found myself in the depths of a chaotic, overly ambitious cleaning spree. You know the kind, where you start by just dusting a little, and somehow end up elbows deep in a forgotten box that hasn't seen daylight in years. I was halfway through reorganizing my closet when I spotted a cracked cardboard shoebox tucked in the back corner, its edges frayed from time and neglect. At first, I almost ignored it, but curiosity has a way of pulling you in like that. I pulled it out, plopped myself on the floor, and opened it, expecting a mess of tangled cords or something equally dull. Instead, I was met with an explosion of childhood, a treasure trove of mismatched Polaroids, loose cassette tapes, crinkled letters, and stickers from some 90s cereal box I barely remembered. The smell hit me first, that unmistakable scent of old paper and plastic, like a library married a thrift shop. It was strange how immediate it was, how much weight it carried. The scent wrapped itself around me, pulling me out of my small apartment and back into a world I hadn't visited in decades. Before I even touched anything in that box, I was gone. Sitting cross-legged in my childhood bedroom on a rainy Saturday morning, cracking open my dad's giant, clunky cassette player to listen to a mix he made me when I was 7. I could almost hear the hiss of the tape rewinding, the faint click of the play button, and the opening chords of some dusty 80s love ballad he insisted was a timeless classic. Back then, I didn't care about lyrics or meanings. I just liked the sounds. But sitting there, in the middle of my cluttered apartment floor, I found myself humming along to songs I hadn't thought about in years, as if my brain had been holding onto them in some secret corner, waiting for the right moment to remind me they existed. I dug a little deeper into the box and pulled out a Polaroid. The photo had faded so much the edges were barely there, but it didn't matter. There we were, my best friend and me, grinning ear to ear in front of a rickety old carnival ride. I could tell by the way my bangs were sticking to my forehead that it had been one of those sticky summer days when the air felt thick enough to chew. In the background, you could just make out the outline of the Ferris wheel we swore we'd conquer later that day, even though both of us chickened out as soon as we got in line. I stared at the photo for what felt like forever, my thumb brushing over the glossy surface, half expecting to feel the warmth of that sun again. That day had been so ordinary. Just two kids blowing what little allowance they had on cheap games and greasy funnel cakes. But it suddenly felt like the most significant memory in the world. And then there was the cassette. Oh, the cassette. Black, scratched, unlabeled. I almost didn't recognize it at first, but when I pulled it out, I noticed the faint scrawl on the inside of the case. My handwriting, messy and determined, proclaiming it the greatest songs ever Volume 3 in bright pink gel pen. I remembered that tape instantly. I had made it during one of those long summers when every day felt like it was 1,000 hours long. Back then, making a mixtape wasn't just about the music. It was a whole ritual. You had to sit by the radio for hours, finger hovering over the record button, ready to pounce the moment your favorite song came on. It didn't matter that every track had a DJ's voice talking over the first few seconds. It was perfect because it was mine. I couldn't resist. I had to know if it still worked. My dusty old cassette player sat on a nearby shelf, unused for ages. but somehow it still turned on with a little coaxing. I popped the tape in and hit play. The room filled with crackling static before the unmistakable opening notes of Smash Mouth's All Star came flooding out, tinny and distorted, but utterly magical. I laughed out loud, full-on, stomach-clutching laughter, the kind that leaves you a little breathless. Suddenly, I was back in my childhood living room, dancing around in pajama pants that were 2 sizes too big, singing the wrong lyrics at the top of my lungs while my mom yelled at me to turn it down. I sat there listening to that tape, flipping it over to side B when it clicked to a stop, completely losing track of time. Each song was another portal to a moment I didn't even realize I'd forgotten. A pool party, a sleepover, a car ride with the windows down, the wind whipping through my hair while my dad drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. The best part, though, came at the very end of side B. After the last song faded out, there was a quiet moment before a much younger version of my own voice crackled through the speakers. "This is the end of Volume 3, I announced proudly, pausing dramatically like I was recording a public service announcement. "Stay tuned for Volume 4, if I ever make one." My voice was so small, so hopeful. I must have replayed that little snippet 5 times, marveling at how foreign yet familiar I sounded. When I finally looked up, the sun was setting outside my window, casting the whole room in this soft, golden glow. It was like the universe knew I needed a backdrop for the moment. I packed up the box carefully, almost reverently, and slid it back into the closet. I didn't put it all the way in the corner this time. I figured it deserved a spot closer to the front, ready for whenever I might need another unexpected trip down memory lane. It's funny how something so small, so random, can have such a hold on you. I wasn't looking for nostalgia that day, but it found me anyway, creeping in like a soft, warm blanket on a chilly evening. And for a little while, the worries of the present didn't seem so heavy. It was just me, my memories, and the quiet hum of something unspoken but deeply familiar. What small, randomly found things bring you a moment of calm nostalgia? The kind of thing that should have set the tone for a rushed, chaotic day. But instead, it felt like the universe was gently nudging me to take my time. The sun streamed through the slats of my blinds, painting golden stripes on the walls. The air smelled like morning dew, clean and crisp, as if the world had hit refresh overnight. I rolled out of bed, feeling unusually light, and decided to let the day unfold on its terms. I didn't have a plan, just a vague notion of escaping the usual. My feet carried me to the train station. There was no destination in mind, just the thrill of getting on a train and seeing where it would take me. When the conductor announced a small coastal town I'd never heard of, I decided that was my stop. As the train rolled through endless fields, my reflection in the window seemed softer, like I was a character in a movie, riding towards some untold adventure. When I arrived, the town greeted me with the smell of salt water and fresh bread. The cobblestone streets seemed to hum under my feet, as if they were alive with stories. I wandered aimlessly, passing pastel-colored buildings and flower carts that felt plucked from a postcard. My stomach growled, and I followed my nose to a tiny cafe tucked into a side street. The sign above the door read Clementines, painted in cursive letters that curled like a wink. Inside, it was warm, with a scent of coffee and cinnamon that felt like a hug. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, their music weaving through the air like sunlight through lace curtains. I ordered a croissant and a cappuccino, the kind where the foam swirled into delicate patterns. The first bite was a revelation. Buttery, flaky, just the right amount of sweet. I closed my eyes, letting the music and flavors blend into a symphony of perfect little moments. It was then that I noticed him. A man sitting by the window, his hair a mix of silver and ash, wearing a battered leather jacket that had clearly seen miles. His eyes met mine, crinkling at the corners with a kind of gentle curiosity. Before I knew it, he gestured toward the seat across from him. Normally, I would have hesitated, maybe even politely declined, but something about his demeanor felt as easy and natural as breathing. His name was Jules, and he spoke with an accent that rolled like the tide, part French, part something else I couldn't quite place. He told me he'd spent his life wandering the world, chasing sunsets and stories. His hands moved as he talked, sketching invisible maps of the places he'd been. Marrakesh, Kyoto, Santiago. Each name sounded like a spell when he said it, conjuring images of lantern-lit alleys and sprawling deserts. I asked him why he traveled so much, and he smiled, a little sad and a little wise, and said, "Because the world is too big to sit still." No? Hours passed like minutes. He told me about a hidden bookstore in Paris where the owner insisted every book found its reader. I told him about the lake near my childhood home where the water turned pink at sunset, like the sky had spilled its blush. We laughed about our bad travel luck. His tale of losing a shoe in a Venetian canal was matched only by my story of being chased by a rogue goat in the Irish countryside. The jazz trio packed up their instruments, and still, we sat there, the conversation flowing like an unbroken current. Eventually, Jules glanced at the clock and sighed. He had a train to catch, he said, but he left me with a notebook. A small, leather-bound thing, he said, was for capturing moments like this. "Don't let the little magic slip away," he said, and then he was gone, swallowed up by the same cobblestone streets that had delivered him. The cafe felt quieter after he left, but I wasn't ready to go home. I wandered toward the water, where the late afternoon light danced on the waves. A street performer was playing a violin, the melody as haunting as it was beautiful. Around him, a small crowd had gathered, but no one spoke. We all just stood there, caught in the spell of the music. I felt my breath hitch, the kind of fullness in your chest that happens when you realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be. When the music ended, the crowd dispersed, but I lingered. The performer noticed and gave me a small bow before packing up his violin. I started walking again, letting the rhythm of my steps match the sound of the waves. The sky had turned that soft, peachy shade of dusk, and the streetlights began to flicker to life one by one. I passed an old couple sitting on a bench, their hands intertwined like they'd been holding on for decades. A child skipped ahead of his parents, his laughter spilling into the air like confetti. Everything felt alive, as if the town itself was breathing along with me. Eventually, I found myself back at the train station. The platform was nearly empty, just me and the sound of an incoming train. I sat by the window again, this time watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. The reflection in the glass still looked like mine, but there was something different in my eyes, an openness, a glow. I felt weightless, as if the whole day had been a gift wrapped in sunlight and jazz notes. When I finally got home, it was late, but I wasn't tired. I opened the notebook Jules had given me, running my fingers over its cover. Inside, the first page had a single line written in his looping handwriting. "The world is big, but days like this remind us it can feel small in all the best ways." I smiled, grabbing a pen to add my own words beneath his. The melody of the day was still playing in my head, and I didn't want to let it fade. Have you ever had a day when it felt like life was playing the perfect melody just for you? There's a deep kind of silence that fills the room when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. That was the silence between me and Ava the morning after we slept together. The sun poured into the room like it hadn't witnessed a friendship implode on that very bed. She was still asleep, her auburn hair a messy halo on the pillow, her freckles softened in the pale light. I stared at the ceiling, trying to summon a logical explanation for what had happened. But there wasn't one. There was no way to rationalize how years of laughter, midnight rants, and unspoken rules had led to this. It had started with a bottle of red wine, as cliché as that sounds. Ava was on a tirade about her ex, his inability to commit, his obsession with cryptocurrency, and how he once gifted her a toaster for their anniversary because it was practical. I was a few drinks in, laughing at her mock outrage, when she turned her gaze on me. That gaze, the one that made me feel seen and unsettled all at once. "Do you think I'm undateable?" she asked, almost too casually. I laughed at first because that was our thing. Turn every heavy moment into a punchline. "Ava, you could date a rock and make it look good," I said. She smiled, but there was something behind it, a quiet vulnerability that I wasn't used to. Before I could think better of it, I told her the truth. "No one dates you because you terrify them. You're too much for most people, but that's what makes you amazing." Her laughter broke the tension, but it didn't dissolve it. We ended up sitting on the floor of her living room, surrounded by empty glasses and a growing sense of inevitability. When she leaned in, it wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was like she already knew how it would end. Like this moment had been preordained in some cosmic script. Her lips brushed mine, soft and tentative, and then we were kissing, really kissing, in a way that made the room tilt. The rest of the night was a blur of skin and whispers and crossed boundaries. It wasn't just the act of sleeping together. It was the intimacy of it, the unspoken understanding that this would either destroy us or change us forever. And now here we were, in the harsh light of morning, with no witty remarks to save us. Ava stirred, groaning as she stretched. When her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something. Regret? Confusion? Relief? "Morning," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, too quickly. The silence stretched between us like an unspoken agreement to avoid the elephant in the room. She got up first, throwing on my hoodie and heading to the kitchen without a word. I followed her, unsure of what else to do. As she poured coffee, I blurted, "So, last night? Can we not?" She interrupted, her tone sharper than I expected. "At least not yet?" I nodded, swallowing the dozen questions bubbling in my throat. We sat at her tiny kitchen table, drinking coffee like it was any other Sunday. Except it wasn't. Every glance, every word, was weighted with the knowledge that things could never be the same. The next few weeks were a strange dance of avoidance and forced normalcy. We didn't talk about that night, but it hung in the air like a storm cloud. We still laughed, still shared our inside jokes, but there was a hesitation in her eyes that hadn't been there before. And then it happened. She started seeing someone else. It was a guy named Liam, a freelance photographer with a man bun and an annoying habit of calling everyone dude. I wanted to hate him, but he was annoyingly likable. Ava seemed happy, and that should have been enough for me. But it wasn't. Every time I saw them together, every time I heard her laugh at one of his jokes, it felt like a small betrayal. Not because I wanted to be with her, but because I wasn't ready to let go of the version of us that existed before that night. One evening, after one too many drinks at a mutual friend's party, I cornered her in the kitchen. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked, my voice low. "Think about what?" she replied, not meeting my eyes. "You know what," I said, my frustration bubbling over. "That night, us. Everything we haven't talked about." She sighed, setting down her drink. "Of course I think about it," she said quietly. "But what good does it do? We can't go back, and we can't go forward. So where does that leave us?" Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right, as always. There was no undoing what had happened. No way to rewrite the story without tearing out entire chapters. In the months that followed, we drifted further apart. Ava and Liam moved in together, and I threw myself into work, into dating, into anything that could fill the void she left behind. We still talked occasionally, but it was different, strained, distant, like we were trying to play roles we no longer fit into. The last time I saw her was at a mutual friend's wedding. She looked radiant, her laughter as infectious as ever. But when our eyes met across the room, there was a sadness there, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd lost. We never spoke again after that night. Sometimes I wonder if we could have handled things differently, if there was a version of us that could have survived. But then I remember the way she looked at me that morning, the way she said, "Can we not?" Like it was already too late. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. And some friendships, no matter how deep, can't survive the weight of everything left unsaid. The other day, I was standing in line at the coffee shop, and I noticed the guy in front of me tapping furiously on his phone with both thumbs like he was defusing a bomb. He was probably just texting, but I couldn't help but think, what a time to be alive. We've evolved from pen pals waiting weeks for a letter to sending rapid-fire messages with emoji hieroglyphics to say, "Got it, thanks." I mean, what would my great-grandmother think of me slapping little yellow faces on the end of every message to express my feelings? She had to wait for entire wars to end to find out how people felt. Now we've got a heart emoji for love, a thumbs up for approval, and, if you're feeling particularly dramatic, a single tear rolling down a cartoon face. As I waited for my latte, I started looking around and noticing all these little quirks of modern life that we've collectively agreed on without any formal vote. Like, for example, the unspoken rule that if someone has AirPods in, they might as well be wearing a "do not disturb" sign. It's wild how earbuds went from being an accessory to a social boundary. You could probably spill coffee on someone with their headphones in, and they just give you a polite nod before going back to their true love. Whatever podcast they're secretly hoping will turn them into an expert on ancient civilizations or cryptocurrency. When I finally got my drink, which, let's face it, was basically dessert in a cup, I thought about how we've rebranded all our indulgences into something deserved. Coffee isn't just coffee anymore. It's a morning ritual. Binge-watching TV shows is self-care. And buying 6 different types of scented candles is creating a vibe. I love it, honestly. There's something kind of sweet about how we're all trying to make our everyday lives feel special, like we're romanticizing reality one oat milk latte and cozy blanket at a time. On my way out, I saw a kid trying to convince his mom to buy him a toy at the checkout stand. Classic. Except it wasn't a toy. It was a ring light for filming TikToks. And it struck me. This is where we are now. In my day, I had to stage my productions using a shaky camcorder and a lot of imagination. This kid? He's got professional lighting and editing software in his pocket before he's even hit puberty. But instead of feeling old and out of touch, I kind of loved it. Watching him passionately explain the importance of good angles to his mom, I thought, hey, maybe he's onto something. After all, who among us doesn't want to be lit from our best side at all times? It's a modern twist on vanity, sure, but it's also kind of hopeful. Like, this kid believes he has something worth sharing with the world. And isn't that kind of beautiful in its own way? Later that evening, I went to a friend's house for dinner, and as we sat around the table, I realized how even this ancient ritual has evolved. We're still gathering to eat, talk, and laugh. But now there's usually at least one phone on the table, screen glowing softly as someone fact-checks a random debate about the history of avocados or cues up a YouTube video to prove a point. At first, it felt a little intrusive, but then I started to think of it as part of the experience. Sharing the internet in real time has become its own kind of bonding. We're not just talking anymore. We're building a scrapbook of memes and links and trivia together. Who knew Wikipedia could be such a conversational wingman? After dinner, we pulled out some old photo albums for nostalgia's sake, flipping through snapshots of terrible haircuts and questionable fashion choices. It hit me then how different it felt from scrolling through digital pictures. The albums were messy and imperfect. Half the photos were blurry, and someone's thumb was in the corner of at least 3 of them. But they were charming in a way that the polished perfection of Instagram can't quite replicate. Still, I don't think one is better than the other. Maybe that's what's so fun about living in this moment. We get to have both. We can take 10 selfies to get the perfect one for our profile picture, but we can also look back at old prints and laugh at how we thought frosted tips were a good idea. Before I went to bed that night, I opened my window to let in the cool night air, and for a moment, I just stood there, phone-free, soaking in the quiet. That's another thing I love about this era. We have all these amazing ways to connect and share, but we're also starting to value the moments when we unplug. People are getting into mindfulness, journaling, yoga, things that feel ancient and new at the same time. It's like we've realized that progress doesn't always mean moving faster. Sometimes it means stopping to appreciate the little things. Like how the sound of crickets at night is still the same as it was 100 years ago, even if the world outside our windows looks completely different. So yeah, the world feels like it's changing faster than ever, but I don't think it's a bad thing. If anything, it's kind of exciting to see how we're adapting, finding new ways to connect, and making traditions out of things that didn't even exist a decade ago. It's like we're all improvising this giant, messy, wonderful play together, and every generation gets to add a new act. What's something in modern life that makes you smile? This morning, I was rummaging through a box of old things in my attic, hunting for Christmas decorations I swore I stored up there last year, when my hand brushed against something soft and familiar. It was a scarf, red with faint, frayed edges, and as I pulled it free, the faintest whiff of it hit me. Not a bad smell, mind you. It was the kind of smell that makes you stop in your tracks, like your brain short-circuits while trying to put the pieces together. It was something like wool, faintly earthy, but mixed with a sweetness that had been buried under layers of dust and time. For a second, I didn't know where I was. The attic disappeared, and I was somewhere else entirely. The scarf had been my favorite when I was about 10 years old. My grandma knit it for me the Christmas before she passed, her gnarled hands working faster than I thought was humanly possible, like she had been racing the clock to finish it. I'd worn it nearly every winter after, until the threads couldn't take it anymore and my mom gently suggested I retire it. The moment I held it again, a floodgate opened. Suddenly, I was back on the hill behind our old house, the one where the neighborhood kids would gather every time it snowed. We had this ancient wooden sled with one runner slightly bent, so it always veered a little to the left. But I didn't care. I could feel the weight of that sled rope in my hands, my fingers stinging from the cold and then burning as I breathed on them to keep them warm. I could hear my own laughter and the way it would mix with everyone else's, rising in the crisp winter air like we were the happiest people alive. It wasn't just the memory itself, it was how the memory felt. I could feel the crunch of the snow under my boots and the way my scarf would itch against my neck when I tucked it too tight. I could taste the weird tang of snowflakes when you caught them on your tongue, and I swear I could smell the air, cold and sharp, with a hint of the bonfire someone always managed to set up at the base of the hill. Those winters were so full, you know? So heavy with things like joy and excitement, things I didn't have names for back then because they were just life. It wasn't something you thought about. It was just something you were in. I couldn't let go of the scarf right away. I sat there holding it in my lap, brushing my thumb along the edges where the yarn had started to unravel. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but at some point, I remembered something else. There was this day, probably the best day, when we had the perfect snow. Not too soft, not too icy. We called it packing snow, the kind that's just right for building forts and snowmen. We'd split into teams and spend hours turning the hill into this epic battlefield. I remember dragging my sled halfway down the hill to use as a barricade while we built up walls of snow around it. My scarf kept falling loose, and I'd stop every few minutes to retie it, annoyed but secretly loving how it felt when the wind couldn't quite reach my neck. When the snowball fight finally broke up, I went home, cheeks raw from the wind and hair damp from melted snow, and Grandma was waiting for me with hot cocoa. Not the instant stuff, but the kind you make in a pot on the stove, with milk that always threatens to boil over if you're not careful. She always added a little cinnamon, which I thought was fancy and grown up back then. I could hear her humming an old song, one I never learned the name of, but still hear in my head sometimes when I'm doing dishes or walking alone. Sitting in the attic, I almost felt like I was there again, watching her pour the cocoa into my favorite chipped mug, the one with a cartoon penguin on it. The memory was so vivid, I could almost hear the soft scrape of the spoon as she stirred in the sugar, could feel the warmth of the mug in my hands. My face had started to ache from smiling, and it was only then that I realized how much my cheeks hurt, sitting there holding the scarf like it was some magical artifact. It's wild how a single thing, a smell, a touch, even just the way the light catches something, can transport you like that. I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't prepared for the joy of it either, like stumbling into a secret treasure chest buried right under your nose the whole time. When I finally made myself put the scarf down, it felt like stepping back through a door I didn't know I'd opened. I was back in the attic, surrounded by boxes and dust, the scarf folded neatly on top of the pile. But for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been given some kind of gift, a moment of childhood so sweet it felt almost edible, like you could taste it if you tried hard enough. I don't know if that's just me, or if everyone has these little moments hiding in the corners of their lives, waiting for something to bring them back. Maybe it's an old book or a song you haven't heard in years. Maybe it's the way the sunlight hits your kitchen table on a certain morning. I guess I'm just curious. What little things bring you back to moments that always warm your heart? I woke up to a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't my alarm clock, too musical, too Johnny for that. It wasn't the clinking of coffee mugs from the kitchen, either, though it had that warmth. Groggily, I opened one eye and realized it was my nightstand. My nightstand, humming a little tune to itself while rearranging its drawers with a sort of casual pride. "Morning," it said brightly when it noticed me stirring. "You snore, you know, but charmingly, like a small bear." Now, I've had some strange mornings, oversleeping, forgetting appointments, realizing I've run out of coffee, but never one where my furniture decided to strike up a conversation. Still, the nightstand's tone was so friendly, so innocent, I couldn't muster much alarm. Thanks? I said, rubbing my eyes. That's when the pillow piped up, muffled but audible from beneath my head. Don't encourage him. He's been bragging all night about how he's the centerpiece of the room, as if that ugly lamp doesn't ruin his whole aesthetic. I heard that, shouted the lamp indignantly, flicking on and off in frustration. I have a classic design. I'm timeless, okay? Just because you're stuffed with feathers and think you're a diva? Okay, I said, sitting up in bed and immediately regretting it. My mattress let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. Finally, do you know how heavy you are when you sleep like that? Do you think I'm a cloud or something? It was at this moment that I realized I might be having the strangest, and yet somehow most delightful, morning of my life. As I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my slippers scuttled into position like loyal puppies, waiting to be worn. There you go, big guy, said the left one. Warm and cozy, just how you like it. The right one added, mind the heel. He's still sore from last week's sprint to the fridge. I had so many questions, but before I could voice them, my closet door creaked open. Good morning, it called out cheerfully. Any particular vibe you're going for today? I've got your I'm pretending to be productive hoodie, or the I gave up on life but make it chic jeans. Or, if you're feeling bold, how about that sweater you never wear because you think it's too tight? I stared at the closet, baffled. How do you even know that? I asked. Please, it said with a dramatic scoff. I see you. Every time you push me aside like some forgotten relic of 2013. It's insulting, really. I had to admit, it had a point. That sweater did get an unfair amount of side-eye from me. As I shuffled toward the kitchen, a chorus of voices erupted around me. The hallway mirror sighed wistfully. You look tired. But it's a good tired. Like you've been through something meaningful, you know? The light switch clicked in agreement. He's got that whole gritty protagonist vibe going on. I like it. Gritty protagonist? I muttered under my breath. I'm just trying to find coffee. The coffee maker, thankfully, was already brewing a pot. I figured you'd need this, it said, its voice deep and soothing, like a barista who moonlighted as a life coach. Rough night? You seemed a little restless. I couldn't decide if I was charmed or unnerved by the sheer attentiveness of my appliances. The toaster was sulking on the counter, mumbling something about being ignored, while the fridge casually dropped ice cubes into its tray like it was flexing. Don't mind them, the coffee maker said. They're just jealous because I'm the most indispensable thing in this kitchen. Not true, shouted the dishwasher from across the room. Without me, he'd be eating off paper plates. And without me, chimed in the stove, he'd be eating nothing but cold cereal. Guys, can we not do this right now? Said the microwave wearily. It's too early for another existential appliance debate. By the time I sat down with my coffee, my dining room chair leaned back ever so slightly, cradling me in what could only be described as a hug. There you go, pal, it said. Take a load off. You deserve it. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Is this my life now? I asked aloud. Depends, said the salt shaker from its perch on the table. Do you want it to be? There was something oddly profound about that. Here I was, surrounded by the opinions of inanimate objects, each with its own personality, quirks, and insecurities, and yet, it was kind of wonderful. Every item in my home suddenly had this vibrant inner life, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt seen, appreciated, even. Sure, the remote control was a bit of a smart aleck, and the showerhead was annoyingly philosophical. Can we ever truly be clean, or are we just washing away layers of our own existence? But there was a strange harmony to it all. By mid-morning, I'd stopped questioning the situation and started leaning into it. The vacuum cleaner and I teamed up to tackle the living room carpet. It complained about the crumbs, but praised my choice of area rug. My headphones sang a Johnny Little tune while I worked, and my phone finally got the chance to vent about all the unread notifications I ignored. By the end of the day, I was chatting with my desk lamp about the meaning of life while my pen critiqued my handwriting. It was like living in the middle of the world's quirkiest talk show, and I kind of loved it. So here's my question to you. If everything in your life suddenly had a voice and a personality, what do you think they'd say? Would your fridge roast your midnight snacking habits? Would your shoes complain about all those times you skipped socks? Or maybe, just maybe, you'd find yourself as charmed by the chaos as I am. I'll never forget that night. It was one of those evenings where the air felt soft, the kind of night that whispers promises of something special. We'd been seeing each other for about a month, nothing too serious yet, but I liked him. He had this quiet confidence about him, like he didn't need to fill every silence, and that made me feel calm in a way I hadn't realized I needed. We decided on a low-key plan, just dinner and a walk. He picked me up, and I remember thinking how effortless he looked. Plain white shirt, jeans, and this brown leather watch with a worn band that seemed so him. I don't know why I noticed that watch so much, but something about it made me want to know the stories it had witnessed on his wrist. He opened the car door for me, and while that's a small gesture, it felt genuine coming from him. Not performative, just natural. Dinner was nice, nothing extraordinary. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his little sister who was finishing art school, and how he once spent 3 hours in the rain just to get tickets to a show she loved. I shared how my dad and I used to sit in the driveway when I was a kid, watching planes take off and imagining where they were going. It was lighthearted and easy, the way conversations should be when you're still getting to know someone. But the real moment came later, after dinner, when he suggested a walk by the lake. There's this path near my place that winds along the water, lit just enough to feel safe, but still private. We strolled in comfortable silence for a bit, the sound of our footsteps blending with the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. He suddenly stopped and turned to face me, his eyes catching the faint glow of the street lamp nearby. "Wait here," he said with a little smile, then jogged off toward a bench a few steps ahead. I stood there, confused but curious, watching as he knelt down by the bench. When he came back, he had something in his hand. One of those tiny dandelions that had gone to seed, the kind you blow on to make a wish. "Here," he said, holding it out. "I saw this earlier and thought you might need it." I laughed, not really understanding what he meant, but then he added, "You told me about the planes, how you used to make wishes when you saw one. You don't get a lot of planes out here, but I figured this works too." It hit me like a wave. He'd listened. Not just heard, but really listened. Something I'd said in passing, something small and almost insignificant, had mattered enough to him that he'd remembered and acted on it. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental in that moment. People don't realize how rare it is to be truly heard until it happens. I took the dandelion from him, smiled, and closed my eyes to make a wish. When I opened them, he was just standing there, watching me with this look that felt warm and steady, like he wasn't waiting for anything, just existing in that moment with me. I didn't tell him what I wished for, but in my heart, I knew it was already happening. We kept walking, and the conversation shifted to sillier topics. What we'd do if we won the lottery, our worst haircut experiences, the kind of house we'd build if we could design anything. But my mind kept drifting back to that dandelion, to the way he'd remembered something so small, something I'd barely thought about after saying it, and turned it into a moment. Later, when he dropped me off, he didn't make a big deal about the goodbye. No lingering looks or overly romantic gestures, just a genuine, "I had a great time tonight. Sleep well." But as I walked into my apartment, I saw it. Sitting on the dashboard of his car, carefully placed where he must see it every day, was another dandelion. I don't know if it was from the same walk or if he'd picked it earlier, but it was there, like a quiet little reminder of what mattered to him. That night stayed with me, not because of some grand declaration or elaborate plan, but because of how present he was, how he noticed the things that so many people might overlook. It was the kind of moment that feels stitched into your memory, soft and quiet, but unshakable. To this day, every time I see a dandelion, I think of him, of that night, of the way he made me feel seen without even trying. Have you ever had a moment on a date that stayed with you for... It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, my beat-up car, a tent I hadn't used since college, and 2 days to myself in the woods. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, just a break from work and the endless pinging of group chats that I somehow never escape. I picked a state park about 3 hours from home, threw some snacks in a cooler, and hit the road Friday afternoon, feeling like I'd finally gotten my life together just by managing to leave the house on time. The first sign that things weren't going to go as planned came about 45 minutes into the drive. My car, which I'd lovingly named Rusty, for obvious reasons, started making this high-pitched whine every time I accelerated. I tried to ignore it, turning the music up and convincing myself it was just the engine's quirky way of expressing joy. That worked until I hit the middle of nowhere and Rusty decided to up the ante by overheating dramatically, steam billowing out from under the hood like a bad Hollywood car chase. I pulled over to the side of the road, cursing and sweating, staring at a cornfield and wondering if this was how I'd die, stranded on some forgotten back road in Ohio. But then, as I was Googling how to tell if your car is dead for real, a turquoise VW van pulled over. The driver was a woman about my age, with messy brown hair, round sunglasses, and a tank top that said, "Not all who wander are lost, but I usually am." Her name was Jade, and she asked if I needed help. I don't know why I trusted her right away, but something about her felt like sunlight on your face after a cold day. She looked at Rusty, popped the hood, and gave me the bad news. My radiator was toast, and there was no way I was driving anywhere. I should have been panicking, but Jade had this weird, calming energy that made everything seem okay. She said she was heading to the same state park I was aiming for and offered me a ride. "It's your lucky day," she said with a grin. "I have snacks, bad playlists, and an empty passenger seat." Normally, I'd never get in a stranger's car, but honestly, my options were limited, and she seemed harmless. Plus, her van had curtains and fairy lights strung across the ceiling. How could someone with fairy lights be a murderer? The next few hours were a blur of laughter, terrible karaoke, and the kind of easy conversation you only have with someone you're probably never going to see again. We got to the park just as the sun was setting, and since I didn't have my car, or most of my camping gear, Jade insisted I camp with her. I protested weakly, but honestly, I was relieved not to be alone. Her setup was ridiculous in the best way. She had a hammock, a collapsible table, and enough string lights to make it look like a Pinterest ad. She even had a portable coffee maker. That night, we sat by her campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. She told me about her road trips, her dream of converting a school bus into a traveling art studio, and the time she accidentally adopted a stray dog in Montana. I told her about my boring office job, the ex who broke my heart 2 years ago, and my vague plan to figure things out someday. It felt like we'd known each other forever. The next day, we hiked one of the park's trails, a 6-mile loop with waterfalls and wildflowers that looked like they belonged in a postcard. At one point, we got lost, of course, but neither of us cared. We found a stream and spent an hour skipping rocks and debating whether hot dogs could legally be classified as sandwiches. By the time we made it back to the van, we were covered in mud and sunburned, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd been that happy. The rest of the weekend was the same kind of chaotic magic. We cooked pancakes over a camp stove and argued about the best Disney villain. She said Maleficent. I said Ursula. We danced around the campsite to Fleetwood Mac like idiots and waved at passing hikers like they were long-lost friends. On the last night, Jade pulled out a cheap bottle of wine and we sat by the fire, watching the stars and talking about all the places we wanted to go someday. Sunday morning came too fast. Jade offered to drive me home, but I didn't want to drag her out of her way, so I called a tow truck for Rusty and said goodbye. She hugged me like we'd known each other for years, and as I watched her van disappear down the road, I felt this weird mix of sadness and gratitude. It was like saying goodbye to summer camp, bittersweet but perfect in its own way. Rusty got fixed, eventually, and I went back to my routine. But every time I see a turquoise van or hear Fleetwood Mac, I think about that weekend and smile. I never got Jade's last name, and we didn't exchange numbers. I don't think we were meant to keep in touch. Some people just come into your life for a moment and make it brighter, and that's enough. Have you ever had a moment that felt crazy but left only happy memories? I wake up yesterday morning and everything seems normal, alarm blaring, my cat aggressively pawing my face because breakfast was, in his opinion, at least 10 minutes late. I stumble out of bed, trip over a pair of sneakers I definitely didn't leave there, and head to the kitchen to make coffee. But then, halfway through pouring the water into the coffee maker, I realize something is off. My kitchen looks bigger. Like, way bigger. We're talking, did I accidentally move into a mansion overnight and forget? Kind of big. At first, I figure I must just be groggy, right? Happens to the best of us. So, I rub my eyes, slap my face a little, which I don't recommend before caffeine, and look around again. Nope, still huge. And not just huge, fancy. My IKEA table and chairs? Gone. Instead, I have this massive wooden dining table with intricate carvings of little woodland creatures on the legs. The kind of table you'd imagine a family of hobbits hosting a feast at. My mismatched mugs have been replaced by delicate porcelain teacups. My fridge? Oh, it's a full-blown vintage icebox now, humming happily in the corner. By this point, I'm too weirded out to even care about coffee. So, naturally, I grab my phone to text my best friend and tell her I've lost my mind. Except my phone isn't on the counter where I left it. It's in the middle of the table, propped up like it's on display. And when I pick it up, it doesn't turn on. It's not even my phone. It's a hand mirror. A really nice one, with a gold handle and some sparkly bits that look like diamonds, but still, a mirror. I look into it, half expecting to see myself looking deranged from lack of caffeine. But no. Instead, I see someone else's face. Let me clarify. It's not just a different face. It's still me, but not? I'm suddenly 10 times more attractive. My skin is glowing like I've been bathing in moonlight, and my hair looks like it was styled by a professional who charges by the strand. Oh, and I'm wearing this fancy tunic thing with embroidered stars on the sleeves. I blink at my reflection, and it winks back at me. I drop the mirror, which of course lands without so much as a scratch, and that's when I notice the windows. Or rather, what's outside them. My view is no longer the parking lot and the neighbor's cat doing his morning stretches. Instead, it's rolling green hills dotted with wildflowers and, wait for it, a literal castle in the distance. A castle, like turrets and flags and everything. I'm just standing there, mouth open, trying to process all this, when I hear a knock on the door. And here's the thing. My apartment doesn't have a door that leads to the outside. I'm on the 3rd floor. Naturally, I go to open it, because curiosity is apparently stronger than self-preservation in this scenario. And there, standing in the doorway, is this guy who looks like he just walked off the set of Lord of the Rings. He's got the whole deal going. Shiny armor, a sword strapped to his hip, and a flowing red cape that honestly looks like it's been dry cleaned recently. He bows, yes, bows, and says, "Your Majesty, the council awaits your decision." Now, let's pause here for a second, because I need you to understand what's going through my head. 1. I'm apparently royalty, which is wild because I can barely manage my monthly budget, let alone a kingdom. 2. There's a council waiting for me to make a decision. I can't even decide what to order for takeout most nights. 3. Why do I have a sudden urge to say, off with their heads, just to see what happens? So, I do what any reasonable person would do in my position. I smile politely, tell him I'll be out in a moment, and close the door. Then I sit down at my hobbit table and try not to hyperventilate. It's fine, I tell myself. Maybe this is just an elaborate dream, and I'll wake up any second now. Or maybe I hit my head on the coffee table, and this is some kind of weird coma hallucination. But then I look down and notice the tunic I'm wearing isn't just embroidered with stars, it's glowing. Subtly, but still, like it's alive. At this point, I decide to roll with it. What's the worst that can happen, right? So, I open the door again, and the night guy, who introduces himself as Sir Elric, because of course his name is Elric, leads me outside to a waiting carriage. And when I say carriage, I don't mean a rickety old thing with squeaky wheels. I mean a gold and silver masterpiece pulled by unicorns. Actual unicorns, with shimmering manes and what I can only describe as attitude. One of them even snorts at me like it's unimpressed with my existence. Fast forward 10 minutes, and I'm sitting in this grand council chamber surrounded by people who look like they take cosplay way too seriously. They're all staring at me expectantly, and I have no idea what's going on. Apparently, There's some big decision I need to make about whether or not to sign a treaty with the neighboring kingdom. They're describing it in terms I don't fully understand, but it basically boils down to, do we want to be friends with these people or not? I glance around the room, trying to stall, and spot a table with snacks in the corner. So, I get up, casually stroll over there, and grab what looks like a fancy pastry. And just as I'm about to bite into it, I hear someone whisper, "That's the Oracle's offering." Of course, it's too late. I've already taken a bite. The room goes dead silent. Everyone's staring at me like I just declared war. And then the pastry starts glowing in my hand. Before I can freak out, a voice booms from nowhere and says, "The chosen one has spoken. The treaty shall be signed." So yeah, that's how I accidentally became the ruler of a magical kingdom and possibly a minor deity. I still don't know what half the buttons on my microwave do, but apparently, I'm qualified to lead a nation. Anyway, if you woke up in a completely different reality tomorrow, what's the first thing you do? I was sitting on a bench downtown the other day, letting the world pass me by like it does when you're not in a hurry. It had rained earlier, so everything was shiny. Streets, leaves, the brass door handle on the cafe across from me. It was one of those weird moments when the city feels alive in a good way, not the overwhelming, chaotic way. As I sat there, sipping my coffee, a guy on one of those electric scooters zipped by, holding a takeout bag in one hand and what looked like a ukulele strapped across his back. He looked like he was living his best life, totally unbothered by the drizzle that was starting up again. And that's when I noticed it. The sheer randomness of how people move through the world these days. Not 10 seconds later, a woman walked past, her dog wearing a raincoat. A raincoat. It was bright yellow, with little reflective strips, like the dog had a job on a construction site. She was talking to her phone on speaker, explaining sourdough starter to someone named Mom. The dog didn't seem impressed by its stylish outerwear, but the lady looked so pleased with herself, it didn't matter. I smiled at that, and then my attention was snagged again by a kid who stopped in front of a puddle and dramatically reenacted something out of a superhero movie, jumping in with both feet like it was his final showdown with evil. His dad was holding an umbrella over him, looking resigned but not mad. The kid stomped once more for good measure, then ran to catch up with his dad, leaving perfect little ripples behind him. The funny thing was, none of this felt unusual. I realized I've been seeing these tiny slices of humanity more and more, as if people are embracing their quirks and putting them out there for anyone who cares to look. Maybe it's always been this way, and I'm just noticing it now. Or maybe we're all collectively leaning into the absurd and the joyful because, honestly, what else can you do? I mean, just last week I saw a guy in a suit carrying a giant bouquet of balloons through a subway station. No explanation, no party in sight. He just had them. And people smiled at him the way you smile at a little kid in a Halloween costume. A sort of shared acknowledgement that, yeah, life can be ridiculous, but sometimes ridiculous is the best part. Then there's this other thing I've been noticing, especially on social media. You can ask anything, and someone will have the answer. Or at least a very confident guess. I asked how to revive a dying pothose plant the other day, and within minutes, strangers were coming to my rescue with tips like, give it a pep talk, and let it soak in the sink like it's had a rough day. I ended up learning about watering schedules and indirect light, but what really stuck with me was how ready people were to help. It's like we've taken the old school neighborly instinct and scaled it up to the whole internet. Need a recipe? Got it. Want to know the best way to open a stubborn jar? Oh, people have opinions. It's oddly comforting to know that, even when we're collectively stressed out or annoyed at the state of the world, we'll still drop everything to debate whether eggshells belong in compost. Back on the bench, the drizzle turned into proper rain, and I thought about heading home. But I stayed a bit longer, watching people improvise their way through the weather. Someone used a pizza box as an umbrella, while another person gave their actual umbrella to a stranger who'd been caught unprepared. A guy in a rain poncho handed a granola bar to a delivery driver who was soaked to the bone, and the driver looked so touched. It gave me that weird lump in the throat feeling. It's these little things, you know? Small gestures that make you believe people are mostly decent, even if you wouldn't think so from the headlines. By the time I finally got up to leave, I was drenched, but I didn't really care. The rain had washed the city clean, and the air felt lighter somehow. I thought about the ukulele guy and the balloon man, the puddle kid and the dog in the raincoat, and I couldn't help but feel a kind of quiet joy. It's like we've all agreed, consciously or not, to make life a little more colorful, a little less predictable. Maybe we're not solving world hunger or curing diseases with our eccentricities, but there's value in making each other smile, even for a moment. So here's my question. Is there a modern trend or habit that simply makes life a little more fun for you? Something that feels like it belongs to this time, this moment, in all its messy, chaotic beauty? I'd love to hear about it. The other day, I was walking through the grocery store, trying to stick to my list but inevitably wandering through aisles I didn't need to be in. It was a weekday afternoon, quiet enough that you could hear the faint music playing over the speakers, some mellow instrumental version of a song that was probably a chart topper 20 years ago. My cart rattled along the tiles as I absent-mindedly grabbed a bag of tortilla chips, completely on autopilot, until I turned a corner into the cereal aisle. And there it was, sitting on a lower shelf, nearly hidden among the modern boxes with their bright, cartoonish mascots. Honeycomb. The box design had changed, sure, but the moment I saw it, I swear it was like the air in the store shifted. A strange hum filled my ears, and for a second, I wasn't in that grocery store anymore. I was sitting cross-legged on the shaggy brown carpet of my childhood living room, wearing my Ninja Turtles pajamas and watching Saturday morning cartoons. The TV was one of those boxy, wood-paneled models that hummed faintly whenever it was on. I could hear the crinkle of the plastic liner as my mom poured a heaping bowl of cereal, the little puffs tumbling out like golden treasure. She always gave me way too much milk, so by the time I got to the bottom, the cereal was half mush, half milk, but I didn't care. I'd slurp it up anyway, the sweetness lingering on my tongue. It wasn't just the cereal, though. The honeycomb commercial would always come on during the cartoon breaks, sandwiched between the latest Stretch Armstrong ad and that slightly unsettling one for Crossfire. Tell me the dramatic rock music in that didn't feel like the most important thing in the world. The commercial jingle played in my head, clear as if someone had just turned on an old VHS. Honeycomb's big. Yeah. I could almost see the goofy, oversized mascot in my mind's eye. I felt an ache, good ache, like I'd found something I didn't know I'd lost. Back in the store, I stood there for a moment, just staring at the box, this portal to a time when my biggest concern was whether I could get away with wearing my pajamas until noon. I grabbed it impulsively, like if I didn't take it home with me, it might vanish forever. As I wheeled my cart away, I swear the lights in the store felt warmer, softer, like the universe was giving me a gentle nudge to enjoy the moment. But nostalgia is sneaky. It doesn't just tug at the easy memories. Later that evening, as I poured myself a bowl of the cereal, it hit me how much I missed those Saturday mornings and how simple they felt. How my mom used to come in with her cup of coffee and sit on the couch, half watching the cartoons with me while flipping through the newspaper. I don't even remember the last time I saw her drink coffee. Somewhere along the way, she switched to tea for her health. I suddenly wanted to call her, just to hear her voice, but also to ask if she remembered those mornings too. Had they been as magical for her as they had been for me? Or had they just been another string of ordinary Saturdays for her as she worked through the constant hum of grown-up responsibilities? The thing about nostalgia is that it doesn't just remind you of the past. It somehow makes the present feel richer, too, like adding a sepia tone to an otherwise normal day. That cereal wasn't even that good, to be honest. It tasted faintly like cardboard and too much sugar, but eating it felt like a quiet reunion with the kid I used to be, the one who thought cartoons were serious business, who believed honeycomb cereal was practically a food group, and who always ate breakfast with one leg tucked under me even though my mom said it would ruin the carpet. As I sat there crunching away, I felt this overwhelming gratitude for that random moment in the grocery store. If I hadn't turned down that aisle, I might not have remembered those mornings with my mom, or the way the sunlight streamed through the living room window at that perfect golden angle, or how my feet used to stick to the tiles in the kitchen when I ran in for a refill of orange juice. The strangest part? I hadn't thought about those mornings in years, maybe decades. It was like someone had pressed a hidden button in my brain and unlocked a secret door to a memory I didn't even know I still had. That's what got me the most. How much I'd forgotten. It's not like I stopped loving those mornings, but life just kept going. layering on new priorities and memories, and somewhere along the way, that simple joy got buried. But now it was back, clear and sharp and glowing. Just because I'd gone grocery shopping on a Tuesday afternoon, it felt almost magical, like time had folded in on itself for a moment to whisper, "Remember this? Remember how good it was?" And it didn't feel sad. If anything, it felt like being wrapped in a warm blanket after coming in from the cold. So now I'm curious, what random moment has brought you back to those warm times you may have even forgotten about? There's this small park a couple of blocks from my old apartment. Nothing fancy, just a patch of green with a scattering of benches and a paved walking path that looped around the edges. You'd miss it if you weren't looking for it, but to us, it was everything. Every evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in shades of pink and gold, that park became our world. It wasn't planned, at least not at first. It started as a one-off thing. A walk to shake off a rough day at work for me, and a chance for her to clear her head after a grueling afternoon class. I remember the first time we went. We grabbed cheap iced coffees from the bodega near the corner and strolled aimlessly, half talking, half listening to the sound of the city winding down. That was the day she told me about her ridiculous childhood dream of opening a bakery for dogs. I laughed so hard I almost spilled my coffee, but when I looked over, her face was so earnest, so bright, that I knew she wasn't joking. From then on, those walks became a thing. We started calling it our hour, though it wasn't always an hour, and it wasn't even always in the evening. Sometimes life got in the way. There were mornings when we'd shuffle to the park instead, me still half asleep and her sipping tea from one of those insulated mugs that kept burning her tongue. In the winter, we'd bundle up so much that we looked like mismatched snowmen. Her in her puffy purple coat with the broken zipper, me in a scarf so long it trailed behind me like a superhero cape. And in the summer, we'd complain endlessly about the humidity but still show up, sweaty cups of lemonade in hand. It was never about the weather, or the coffee, or even the park. It was about carving out a space that was just ours. There was this bench near the biggest tree, halfway hidden by bushes. It was old and wobbly, and one of the slats had a jagged crack in it, but it became our favorite spot. Sitting there, we could see the entire park, the joggers, the dog walkers, the kids chasing each other around the jungle gym. That bench saw everything. It saw her cry when she didn't get the internship she wanted so badly. It saw me fidget nervously with the ring box in my pocket the day I was trying to figure out how to ask her to move in with me. It even saw our first argument, a stupid one about whether Friends or The Office was the better comfort show. She thought I was ridiculous for insisting Ross and Rachel were the blueprint for toxic relationships, and I thought she was delusional for saying Michael Scott was underrated as a boss. We argued like kids but made up like adults, apologizing quietly while the sky turned orange. One spring, the city decided to renovate the park. For weeks, it was fenced off, the sound of jackhammers replacing the chirping of birds. I thought that would be the end of it, but she had other ideas. One evening, she showed up at my office with a picnic basket and dragged me to the rooftop of her building. It wasn't the same, of course. No trees, no benches, no kids playing tag. But she laid out a blanket, handed me a thermos of coffee, and told me to close my eyes. "Just imagine it," she said, her voice soft but insistent. And for a moment, I could almost feel the breeze from the park, hear the shuffle of leaves and the distant bark of someone's overexcited terrier. When I opened my eyes, she was looking at me like she always did, like I was home. Eventually, the park reopened, shinier and newer, but somehow less familiar. The old bench was gone, replaced by one of those sleek metal ones that feel cold no matter the weather. We tried to make it work, tried to reclaim what we had there, but it wasn't the same. The walks became less frequent, replaced by other things: lazy mornings with pancakes, late-night drives to nowhere, Sunday afternoons spent wandering through flea markets. Life shifted, as it does, but those walks stayed with me in ways I didn't expect. Sometimes, I'd catch myself looking for her hand when we crossed the street or listening for the way she'd laugh at my dumb jokes about the squirrels in the park. And even when we weren't walking anymore, I felt the echo of it, that simple act of carving out time for each other in a world that never stops moving. We're not together now. I won't get into the why of it, because that's not really the point. The point is that I still think about those walks, about how something so small, just an hour in a tiny, forgettable park, could hold so much. I think about the little rituals that tie us to people, the ones we don't even realize matter until they're gone. I still go to that park sometimes, though not as often. The new benches are still too cold, the new playground too polished. But on good days, when the sun hits just right and the air smells like spring, I can almost feel it again. That quiet, perfect magic of walking beside someone who knows you better than anyone else. So, what about you? What little rituals add warmth to your relationships? The air was thick with heat, the kind of sweltering humidity that clings to your skin and presses on your chest. It was one of those nights when everything feels possible, teetering on the edge of something you can't quite name but desperately want to experience. I stepped into the bar, my hair sticking to the nape of my neck and my cheeks already warm from the wine I'd shared with my friends beforehand. The dim light bounced off glasses and faces, everyone slightly blurred, as if the night itself were made of soft, focused dreams. I saw him the moment I walked in. He was tall, leaning against the counter with the kind of confidence that doesn't need words to announce itself. His shirt was open at the collar, revealing a sliver of golden skin, and his smile, the kind that should have come with a warning label, flashed at the bartender. I told myself I was here for a laugh, for the kind of harmless fun that starts with laughter and ends with greasy fries at a late-night diner. But my stomach flipped when his gaze caught mine. It was electric, like someone had flipped a switch in a room I didn't even know existed inside me. I don't know how it started. Maybe it was the slow magnetism of shared glances, the accidental brushing of hands as I ordered a drink, or the way he leaned closer to hear me over the music. Whatever it was, within an hour, we were tucked into a corner booth, trading stories and stolen touches. His voice had a roughness to it, as though it had been worn down by late nights and too many cigarettes. I should have been wary. My friends always tease me about my knack for picking the wrong ones. But this wasn't about caution or logic. This was about the now, the electric thrum of possibility. When he kissed me, it was like a challenge. His lips were warm, demanding, and I matched him, breath for breath, heartbeat for heartbeat. We spilled out into the sticky night air, laughing as if we had stumbled on some secret only we were meant to share. The city buzzed around us, but it felt like the world had narrowed to just us two. His hand on my waist, the way he whispered something low and urgent into my ear. It was intoxicating. Before I could second guess it, we were in a cab, our fingers laced, our knees bumping as the driver weaved through traffic. His apartment was small but clean, the kind of place that suggested he spent more time out than in. I remember the light, a soft, amber glow that made everything feel warmer, more intimate. Clothes came off in a tangle, laughter mixing with breathless gasps. It wasn't just sex. It was a collision, a reckless, wonderful, messy meeting of two strangers who didn't know each other anything except this moment. Morning came like a thief, stealing away the magic with a harsh light that streamed through the blinds. I woke up to find him watching me, a soft smile playing on his lips. For a second, I let myself imagine what it would be like to stay. To let this be the beginning of something instead of just a fleeting spark. But reality has a way of creeping in, and I knew better than to linger too long in what-ifs. We parted with a kiss that felt both final and open-ended. He said something about seeing me again, and I smiled, non-committal, as I stepped into the cool morning air. The walk home was surreal. The city felt quieter, as if it were holding its breath. I replayed the night in my head, every touch, every word, trying to hold on to it even as it began to fade. I felt alive, electric, but also hollow in a way I couldn't quite place. It wasn't regret, not exactly, but something close to it. A sense of having crossed a line I hadn't realized existed. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd always thought of myself as someone who embraced freedom, who could indulge in moments like these without overthinking them. But this time was different. I found myself questioning what I wanted, what I was looking for in these fleeting encounters. Was it the thrill of the unknown? The validation of being wanted, even if only for a night? Or was it something deeper, a yearning for connection that I hadn't yet admitted to myself? I didn't text him, and he didn't text me. Maybe that was for the best. Some nights are meant to stay in their bubble, perfect and untouched by the weight of reality. But it left me wondering, how many of these nights could I collect before they stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like loneliness in disguise? I thought about the way he'd looked at me, the way I'd felt in his arms, powerful, desired, but also vulnerable. It was a heady mix, and it left me reeling. Weeks passed, and the memory of that night softened, became less sharp around the edges. I started to go out again, meeting people, laughing with friends, but there was a new layer to it now. A question that lingered at the back of my mind. What am I really chasing? I don't have an answer yet. Maybe I never will. But that night changed something in me, cracked open a part of myself I hadn't looked at too closely before. And maybe that's the point, to keep searching, to keep feeling, even when it scares you. Because in the end, isn't that what life is about? The mess, the beauty, the chaos of it all? I like to think so. Or at least, I hope so. Yesterday morning, I was standing at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, when I caught myself feeling like an anthropologist in my own city. It was one of those moments where everything suddenly seemed a little foreign, even though I'd walked that same stretch of pavement 1,000 times. The day had barely begun, and the air was crisp with a hint of winter. Around me, the city was alive with its quiet choreography, an unspoken dance of people moving through their routines. To my right, a man in a puffer jacket and sneakers was mumbling into his AirPods, gesturing just slightly with his free hand. At first, I thought he was talking to me, and I instinctively turned, but of course, he was deep in some invisible conversation. A teenager nearby had the same earbuds but was staring straight ahead, her hands buried in her hoodie pocket while her thumbs twitched against an imaginary screen. It struck me then how these tiny movements, so subtle you'd miss them if you weren't looking, carry entire worlds within them. Who was the man talking to? Was he resolving a problem at work? Or was it something as simple as deciding what to have for dinner? And the girl, what was she doing in her mental space? Was she lost in some new game? Or just keeping her mind busy while waiting for the green light? These are the things we rarely stop to think about, but they make up the invisible threads holding everything together. The crosswalk light blinked on, and everyone surged forward in unison like birds taking flight. I trailed behind, my pace slower than the others, still caught up in the odd beauty of it all. Across the street, an older woman sat at a bus stop reading a paperback novel, flipping pages with a deliberate rhythm that felt like an act of defiance against the tide of phone screens around her. Right next to her, a young man in a suit scrolled furiously through emails, his brow furrowed as if he were solving the world's most urgent problems. Neither seemed to notice the other. They were only inches apart, but their realities couldn't have been further from each other. Yet there they were, sharing the same bench, part of the same moment in time. As I walked past them, I heard a snippet of conversation between two women who had just exited a coffee shop. Their laughter rang out in the kind of way that makes you smile without realizing it. I couldn't catch their words, but their tone told me everything. It was the kind of laugh that comes after someone says something cheeky, the kind that makes you feel connected to someone even if you're an outsider. I wondered how many of these little moments ripple outward, altering the mood of a stranger walking by or softening the edges of someone else's bad day. It's like some secret language we all speak without realizing it. Further down the block, I passed a construction site. Workers in bright orange vests were hauling equipment, their movements purposeful but surprisingly relaxed, as if their bodies had learned to save energy in the right places. One of them called out to another, his voice cutting through the hum of machinery and traffic. There was something oddly comforting about the sound, like a reminder that even in all the chaos, there's order. I thought about how those beams and bricks would eventually become a building, a place where people might live or work or fall in love, all because of the rhythms these men followed today. And yet, I bet none of them were thinking about that. Just the next task, the next piece of steel to bolt down. When I stopped at a coffee stand, the barista greeted me with a smile that seemed to come from genuine muscle memory rather than obligation. Her hands moved so quickly, pouring, steaming, handing back change, that it felt almost mechanical. But then, as she handed me my cup, she tilted her head and said, "Love your scarf." It caught me off guard, not because it was unusual, but because it was so ordinary, the kind of comment that could pass unnoticed on a busy day. Yet for some reason, it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. I found myself watching the rest of the line as I walked away, marveling at the micro-interactions between her and each customer. A rushed thank you here, a distracted glance there. Each exchange was fleeting, but you could tell which ones were genuine, the ones where people paused long enough to look her in the eye. I wondered how those brief moments shaped her morning. Did the grumpy customer bother her as much as the friendly one lifted her mood? Or had she learned to let it all roll off her, the way waves retreat from the shore? By the time I got to the park, the morning rush had faded, replaced by dog walkers and joggers weaving around each other on the paths. A man in a neon green windbreaker jogged past me, his footsteps rhythmic against the gravel, while a woman nearby held a phone up to her face, laughing as she video called someone. Dogs tugged at leashes, chasing after pigeons or each other, and I couldn't help but feel like I was in the middle of some grand, unscripted play. None of these people knew each other, but their actions fit together like puzzle pieces, creating a moment that felt oddly whole. I sat on a bench for a while, sipping my coffee and watching the world. I couldn't stop noticing the little things. The way people instinctively step aside for each other without breaking stride. The way the sound of an ambulance briefly hushes a busy street before the noise picks up again. The way a kid's laughter rings out in the middle of it all, cutting through the layers of adult preoccupation like a bell. It all felt so intricate and deliberate, yet completely unconscious, as if we've all learned a silent set of rules without ever being taught. I started to think about how these tiny, almost invisible moments shape our lives without us even realizing it. An overheard joke that lingers in your mind all day. The way everyone at a bus stop looks down at their phones, creating an unspoken agreement to avoid eye contact. A random stranger holding a door open just a second longer than expected. None of it is remarkable on its own, but together, they create a kind of unspoken culture, a shared language we're all fluent in even when we feel disconnected. By the time I got up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd spent the morning as a traveler in my own world. It's funny how the smallest things, the nearly invisible ones, can suddenly make everything feel new again. What part of our everyday society makes you feel like a traveler in your own world? So, here's a fun little thing that happened. I woke up this morning, rolled out of bed like usual and stretched, but instead of the usual creaks and groans from my stiff joints, I heard, "Morning, champ." My first thought was, cool, I've finally lost it. This is what too much TikTok does to a person. But then I turned around and saw my cat, Juniper, perched on the windowsill, staring at me like she's been waiting for this moment her whole life. She tilted her head and said, very matter-of-factly, "You're late. The sun's been up for hours." Her tone was not dissimilar to a passive-aggressive manager. Naturally, I did the only thing any sane person would do. I stared at her and whispered, "Am I dreaming?" To which she replied, "No, but you are drooling." Side note, that last bit was unnecessarily rude. No one asked for honesty from a cat first thing in the morning. After the initial shock wore off, I realized I wasn't just hallucinating Juniper's voice. When I walked into the kitchen, the coffee machine muttered, "Finally, I thought you'd never show up." The fridge chimed in with, "Don't forget about the milk, it's about to turn." Again. And the toaster, not to be outdone, said, "Who's feeling adventurous today? 2 minutes or 3? For reasons I cannot explain, I didn't panic. It was like my brain just accepted that this was my new normal. Talking cat, sassy appliances, why not? While I was trying to wrap my head around this new reality, Juniper followed me into the kitchen and hopped onto the counter. "I'm going to need more treats if we're doing this communication thing now," she said. I asked her what she meant by doing this thing, and she blinked at me slowly before answering, "You can talk to us now, obviously. You're not the brightest human, are you?" Again, rude. But then she sat down primly and said, "Don't worry, I'll catch you up. We've got time." It was about this point that I realized my couch and armchair were having a hushed conversation about how I never use coasters. The couch, bless its lumpy little heart, sounded deeply offended. Does she think I enjoy water rings? Does she think they add character? The armchair was more forgiving. Maybe she just doesn't understand. Humans are simple creatures. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or apologize. In the end, I did both. As the day went on, I started to notice that every object in my house had a distinct personality. My favorite mug, who insists on being called Earl, is a snob and refuses to hold instant coffee. The showerhead has a lot of opinions about water pressure and how I never adjust the temperature correctly. The TV, which seems to have adopted the personality of a cranky grandparent, complained that I scroll too much and never actually watch anything. Even the blender, usually dormant and unassuming, whispered to me, "Let's make smoothies." It's been months, with the enthusiasm of someone pitching a startup. It wasn't just the objects, though. The birds outside my window started chirping what can only be described as bird gossip. Apparently, the blue jay who frequents my bird feeder is kind of a jerk. He never shares, one sparrow told me indignantly. He's always hogging the sunflower seeds. It's selfish, is what it is. At one point, I decided I needed to test the limits of this newfound ability, so I went outside to see if the squirrels had anything to say. Spoiler, they do, and they are hilarious. One squirrel kept yelling, "Acorns are life," while another was trying to convince me to build a tiny bridge for them to get to the bird feeder. "Think about it," she said. "It would be revolutionary. The birds get enough as it is." By mid-afternoon, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor, deep in conversation with Juniper. She was explaining the hierarchy of neighborhood cats to me, complete with a detailed PowerPoint-like presentation made entirely of paw gestures and tail flicks. The orange tabby from 3 doors down is in charge, but only because he's enormous. Everyone knows size equals power. It's barbaric, really. When I asked where she fit into the hierarchy, she gave me a smug look. "Oh, I'm above it all. They don't mess with me because I'm mysterious." Sure, Juniper. The weirdest part? The whole day was surprisingly relaxing. I mean, yes, it's strange to have your houseplants critiquing the way you water them. Too much on Monday, not enough on Thursday. Honestly, it's like you're trying to kill us. But it also gave me a sense of connection I didn't know I was missing. I've never felt closer to my furniture, my cat, or the world outside my window. It was like my house had come alive, and instead of being creepy, it was comforting, like everyone was looking out for me in their own bizarre way. At the end of the day, as I was crawling into bed, my pillow said softly, "Sweet dreams," and I think I almost cried. Then Juniper jumped onto the bed and muttered, "Don't get used to it. Pillows are suck-ups." I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the bed. So, here's my question. If you could spend a day in a reality like this, where everything around you talks and has its own personality, would you do it? Or would the sheer absurdity drive you up the wall? I think I'm loving it so far, but ask me again in a week. A few years ago, I was stuck in that weird limbo between jobs. Too many applications sent out to count, no interviews lined up, and a sense of malaise so heavy it felt like it was sinking into my bones. To shake off the funk, I decided to take a walk. Not a planned, purposeful walk with a route in mind, but one of those let's just see where I end up wanderings. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air smells like leaves and smoke from distant chimneys, and I figured at the very least, I get some fresh air and a clearer head. I drifted through the neighborhood, following the kind of arbitrary whims that only come when you have nowhere particular to be. A left at the corner with the big sycamore tree, a right at the house with the faded yellow shutters, then down a side street I'd never bothered to notice before. It was quieter there, just the occasional sound of a bird or the rustle of leaves underfoot. The houses were older, the kind with wide front porches and ivy creeping up the brickwork, and there was something almost sleepy about the street, as if it existed just a little outside of time. About halfway down, I saw an old man sitting on his porch, surrounded by an absolute army of pumpkins. Not just a few jack-o'-lanterns, but dozens of them, scattered across the steps, the railing, even the little patch of lawn in front. Some were carved with intricate patterns, stars and moons, cats arching their backs, while others had whimsical faces, all crooked grins and missing teeth. It was like stepping into a fairy tale. I must have been staring, because the old man called out, "You like him?" His voice was raspy, like he'd spent a lifetime shouting over machinery or maybe just laughing too hard. Before I could even answer, he waved me over, grinning like he'd been waiting all day for someone to notice his handiwork. I'm not usually the type to approach strangers, but there was something disarming about him, like an uncle you only see at Thanksgiving but who always remembers your favorite pie. So, I walked up the creaky steps, and he launched right into it, telling me about how he'd been carving pumpkins every fall for as long as he could remember. "People think I'm crazy," he said, "but I figure, why not? World's got enough serious in it already." He told me his name was Arthur, and before I knew it, I was sitting on the porch with him, listening to stories about the pumpkins. There was one with a lopsided face he called Sam, who apparently had a habit of scaring the neighborhood kids, and another, carved into a perfect replica of a sunflower, that he said was inspired by a girl he'd loved back in the 60s. "She had this sunflower tattoo," he explained, his eyes crinkling at the memory. "Back when that was a big deal, you know? Never saw her again, but I figure, what's the harm in remembering?" At some point, he asked if I wanted to carve one, too. I hesitated, thinking of all the reasons I should head back home. Job applications to send, laundry to fold. But then he handed me a little carving knife and a pumpkin with a knowing smile, like he could tell I needed a break even more than I realized. So, I stayed. We carved in companionable silence for a while, the kind where you don't feel the need to fill the space with words. My pumpkin turned out a little rough. Its smile was more of a grimace, and one of the eyes was decidedly wonky. But Arthur just laughed and said, "Perfect. Gives it character." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the porch, Arthur started telling me about his late wife, May. "She used to sit right there," he said, pointing to the spot beside him. "Always thought my pumpkin obsession was ridiculous, but she never missed a year." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled Polaroid, handing it to me with a kind of reverence. It was faded and dog-eared, but I could just make out a younger Arthur, grinning with his arm around a woman holding a pumpkin almost as big as she was. "She's been gone a long time now," he said softly, "but I like to think she's still laughing at me from wherever she is." By the time I finally got up to leave, the stars were just starting to peek out, and the streetlights cast a soft glow over the pumpkins, making them look almost alive. Arthur walked me to the edge of the porch, handing me a tiny pumpkin no bigger than an apple. "For luck," he said. "Carry it with you. You never know what might come of it." I carried that little pumpkin home, and for weeks afterward, every time I looked at it, I felt a strange kind of warmth, like I'd stumbled into some hidden pocket of the universe where time moved a little slower, and people like Arthur existed to remind you that not everything in life needs to have a purpose to matter. A few months later, I got the job I'd been hoping for, and life picked up its usual pace. The pumpkin eventually shriveled and had to be thrown away, but I couldn't bring myself to forget Arthur or his porch full of whimsical, grinning pumpkins. Every fall since, I've carved at least one, just to keep the tradition alive. I even gave my lopsided one a name, Sam, just like Arthur did. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has ever stumbled across Arthur's porch, or if it was one of those rare, fleeting moments meant just for me. I've walked that street a few times since and never seen him again, but part of me likes to think he's still there, waiting to share his pumpkins and his stories with the next curious passerby. Have you ever felt like the world gave you a playful wink? A moment that made you stop and think, well, that was unexpected, but kind of perfect? It started as the most ordinary of Saturdays, the kind where the world feels stuck in a loop. I had plans to do absolutely nothing special. A walk to the farmer's market, maybe a coffee, then home to binge-watch something I'd already seen 3 times. I don't know what I expected, but it certainly wasn't this. I stepped out into the crisp morning air and took a deep breath, noticing a faint smell of lavender that wasn't usually there. The street looked just like it always did, except the sunlight seemed, I don't know, warmer. Not hotter, just more golden than usual, as if the light itself had been steeped in honey. It wasn't dramatic enough to make me stop and stare, but it lingered in the back of my mind as I headed down the street, my sneakers crunching softly on the pavement. The first thing that threw me off was the alley. Normally, it was just a cut-through between the library and an old record store, barely worth noticing. But as I walked past, I heard music, a tinkling, lilting tune that sounded like someone playing a glass harp. The kind of sound that makes you pause mid-step, not entirely sure if you're imagining it. Intrigued, I backtracked a few paces and peered into the alley, expecting to find someone busking or maybe an open window with a radio playing inside. Instead, I saw a cat. It was perched on a stack of old wooden crates, grooming itself with all the elegance of a feline royal. Its fur was an odd silvery shade that shimmered when the sunlight hit it, like a mix of moonlight and smoke. When it noticed me, it didn't bolt like most stray cats would. It looked right at me with startlingly green eyes, almost too green, like they'd been photoshopped. Then, to my utter disbelief, the cat jumped down and padded further into the alley, pausing just long enough to glance back, as if it wanted me to follow. Now, let me be clear. I'm not the kind of person who chases strange animals into sketchy alleys, but there was something about this cat, something magnetic, like it knew something I didn't. So, against my better judgment, I followed. The alley wasn't particularly long, but it felt different somehow. The walls were covered in vines that hadn't been there the last time I'd looked, tiny purple flowers blooming amidst the greenery. The air smelled richer, sweeter, and that music, the glass harp melody, grew louder with each step. I should have been creeped out, but instead, I felt this strange sense of calm, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The cat led me to the far end of the alley, where an archway of tangled branches formed a sort of doorway I was sure hadn't existed yesterday. Beyond it, there was a small courtyard, a hidden pocket of the world that felt utterly untouched by time. The courtyard was magical, for lack of a better word. There was a fountain in the center, the water sparkling like liquid diamonds as it cascaded down. Around the edges were little market stalls draped in colorful fabrics, each one manned by people who looked like they'd stepped out of a storybook. A woman with hair like spun gold sold jars of what she called sunlight honey, while an older man in a dark coat offered tiny bottles filled with shifting colors that he claimed were pocket sunsets. There was even a stall with books that seemed to write themselves as you held them, blank pages filling with your thoughts and dreams the moment you touched them. And then there was the food. Oh, the food. A man with a mischievous grin handed me a small pastry and told me it was a starberry tart. I don't know what I expected when I bit into it, but it tasted like the first time you laugh after crying, like the moment after a storm when the sun comes out. It was joy and nostalgia and comfort wrapped in flaky golden layers, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. The cat, meanwhile, had disappeared. Just poof, gone. I wandered around the courtyard for what felt like hours, chatting with the stall owners, sampling their wares, and soaking in the atmosphere. Nobody seemed to mind that I didn't have any money. They just smiled and said things like, "We don't trade in coins here." When I asked what they did trade in, one of them, a woman with eyes like the night sky, simply said, "Moments." I wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but it didn't feel threatening, more like an invitation to just be present. Eventually, I noticed the sky starting to change. The golden light of the courtyard dimmed slightly, and the music, though still playing, grew softer, more wistful. A feeling of goodbye settled over the place, and the stall owners began packing up as if on some unspoken cue. One by one, they disappeared, until it was just me and the fountain. That's when I saw the cat again, sitting by the archway. It gave me a single meow, as if to say, "Time to go." I hesitated, not ready to leave. But the cat had already turned and slipped through the archway, and some invisible force tugged at me to follow. When I stepped back through, the alley was just an alley again. No vines, no music, no magic. The silvery cat was gone, and the world felt almost painfully ordinary. I wandered to the farmer's market in a daze, half convinced I dreamed the whole thing. But when I reached into my pocket to pay for a bag of apples, I found a tiny bottle of shifting colors, the kind I'd seen at one of the stalls. The man at the market stall must have noticed the look on my face because he asked if I was okay. All I could do was nod, clutching the bottle like it was a lifeline. I still don't know what happened that day. I've walked past that alley a dozen times since, but it's never been anything more than a shortcut again. And yet, every so often, when the sunlight hits just right or I catch a whiff of lavender on the breeze, I wonder if the courtyard is still out there somewhere, waiting for another curious passerby. Have you ever had a day where reality felt almost like a dream or a strange fairy tale? Okay, here goes. So, I have this little thing I do when I develop a crush on someone, and I'm almost too embarrassed to admit it, but I feel like this is a safe space. Or at least as safe as the internet gets. Basically, whenever I start liking someone, I become a quiet investigator. No, not in a creepy way. I'm not out here stalking them or digging through their social media like a detective piecing together a criminal case. It's more subtle than that. It's like I turn into this undercover agent trying to figure out who they really are through the tiniest details. It usually starts small, like noticing how they always order the same type of coffee. Boom. That's my first lead. Now I'm mentally filing it away like it's part of some imaginary dossier. Subject prefers black coffee with 2 sugars. Likely hates lattes. Potential anti-foam bias? And then, when I've gathered enough evidence, I'll start orchestrating these absurd little coincidences to casually match their vibe. If they mention a favorite book, you can bet I'll have a copy of it conspicuously sitting on my desk within a week, dog-eared to make it look like I've read it 10 times. I'm usually speed reading it the night before. If they hum a song during work, that's it. That song is now my anthem. I'll be blasting it in my car, dissecting the lyrics like I'm studying for an emotional pop quiz. The thing is, this isn't some grand master plan to win their affection. It's more like my way of feeling closer to them without actually doing anything. It's my own little world where I get to admire them quietly without the risk of face-planting in front of them, which, let's be honest, is 100% inevitable if I try to flirt. One time, I had a crush on this guy in my office who always talked about hiking. I am not a hiker. My idea of outdoorsy is eating brunch on a patio. But before I knew it, I was spending my weekends in hiking gear, pretending I wasn't gasping for air while scaling a hill because I just had to understand what he loved about it so much. And no, I never ended up telling him I liked him, but I did become weirdly knowledgeable about local trails. It gets even more ridiculous in dating. I once had a boyfriend who was obsessed with this obscure sci-fi series. He could quote every line, knew every character's backstory, and even had merch. I decided I was going to surprise him by becoming an expert too. I binged the entire series, like 14-hour days of TV, and made notes. I even learned a few lines of their made-up alien language so I could throw it into conversation casually, like, oh yeah, the Zorgonian Creed was so moving in that one episode. And when he looked at me, all impressed, I thought, this is it. I've cracked the code to love. Spoiler, I hadn't. He was flattered, but also slightly freaked out. It turns out there's a fine line between thoughtful effort and are you a shapeshifter? Honestly, I think the funniest part is that I don't always consciously realize I'm doing it. My best friend pointed it out once when we were grabbing coffee, and I was absently humming some random song. She was like, isn't that the song that guy from work likes? And I just froze mid-sip like a deer in headlights. It hit me that, yes, I'd been humming it for weeks now, completely unaware that it had wormed its way into my brain just because he liked it. She calls it my love mimicry phase, like I'm some kind of romantic parrot. It's not all bad, though. Sometimes it leads to these beautiful little connections. There was this girl I had a massive crush on in college. She was into poetry, specifically the really weird, abstract kind where half the words don't make sense, but you're supposed to pretend they do. So, naturally, I started going to every spoken word event I could find, even though I had no clue what anyone was talking about. But then, one night, she read this poem about her grandmother's garden, and it was so beautiful it actually made me cry. I remember thinking, wow, maybe this quirk of mine isn't just about crushes. Maybe it's about opening myself up to things I wouldn't normally experience. I never told her why I started going to those events, but we became good friends after that, and I still go to poetry nights sometimes, even now. The downside, of course, is that this whole thing means I spend way too much time in my own head, creating these elaborate fantasies instead of, actually talking to the person. Like, what am I even afraid of? That they'll find it weird that I also suddenly like artisan cheese or 80s horror films? But I guess there's comfort in the safety of it, in imagining all the what-ifs without risking rejection. It's a weird little system that somehow feels like self-sabotage and self-preservation all at once. I've been trying to be braver about it lately, though. Instead of just quietly adopting their hobbies, I'm starting to actually share my own interests with the people I like. Baby steps, you know? Like, instead of pretending I've always been into whatever obscure indie band they love, I'll just say, hey, I don't know much about this, but it seems cool. Can you tell me more? It feels way more honest and way less exhausting than keeping up my little crush chameleon act. Still, old habits die hard. I caught myself Googling intro to soccer strategies last week because of this guy I met at a party. So, progress is a work in progress. Anyway, that's my little quirk. I basically turn into a human sponge when I like someone, soaking up their interests, their habits, their quirks, like I'm trying to learn the secret recipe that makes them who they are. Is it awkward? A little. Endearing? I hope so. Do you have any little dating quirks you've never told anyone about? Please tell me I'm not the only one out here living a rom-com in my own head. The air was heavy with the faint smell of rain, a kind of hushed stillness lingering in the spaces between cars on the quiet street. Alia leaned her head against the cool glass of the bus window, her breath making soft, foggy patches that faded almost as quickly as they appeared. She wasn't sure why she had come back, or if there was a right way to explain it to herself. The last time she had left, she had promised it would be forever, a definitive closing of a door. But forever turned out to be heavier than she'd imagined. A suitcase you drag behind you even when you've long forgotten what's inside. She stepped off the bus and onto the cracked pavement of her old neighborhood. Everything looked almost exactly the same, which somehow made it worse. The faint buzz of fluorescent light from the corner store, the rusted bike leaning against the fence 2 houses down. It all whispered that nothing here had moved forward, even though she had tried so hard to. She adjusted her scarf and started walking toward the house, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets, as if she could keep the cold and the memories at bay. The house was smaller than she remembered. The pale blue paint was peeling now, the window boxes empty except for a clump of dead vines. It wasn't an unfriendly sight, but it was one that spoke of tiredness, of a place that had been lived in and forgotten in the same breath. Alia hesitated at the gate, her fingers brushing the latch before pulling back. She told herself she was just catching her breath, but she knew better. The silence wasn't only outside. It was in her too, pressing against the walls she had carefully built over the years. The door creaked open before she could knock. Her mother stood there, framed by the dim hallway light, wearing the same tired expression Alia had seen 1,000 times before. But something in her eyes was different. Softer, maybe, or just a little sadder. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the unspoken words piling up between them like snow on a cold morning. "You're back," her mother said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Alia nodded. For a little while. Her mother stepped aside, letting her in without another word. The house smelled the same, lavender and something faintly medicinal. It made Alia feel both comforted and on edge, like stepping into a memory she wasn't ready to relive. She slipped off her shoes and walked into the living room, where the old armchair still sat in its usual spot by the window. The television hummed softly in the background, a news anchor's voice drifting through the air like a ghost. Her mother sat down in the chair, her hands resting on her lap as if to keep them from fidgeting. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," she said after a while. "I wasn't sure either," Alia admitted. They sat like that for a long time, the weight of the years between them settling into the quiet. Alia traced the patterns on the rug with her eyes, trying to think of something to say that wouldn't sound hollow. It was strange, being here again. The space felt smaller, like it had folded in on itself without her. Her mother broke the silence. "I didn't touch your room." Alia blinked, surprised. "Why?" Her mother shrugged, but there was something tentative in the gesture. "I thought you might want it. In case you ever came back." The words hung in the air, unfinished but complete enough to make Alia's chest tighten. She nodded, unsure of how to respond, and stood up, needing to move, to do something other than sit in this thick, unspoken tension. She walked down the hallway, her fingers brushing against the walls as she passed. The door to her old room was closed, the wood slightly warped from years of shifting seasons. She hesitated, then pushed it open. The room was almost exactly as she had left it. The bed was neatly made. The books on the shelf lined up in their familiar, crooked order. Even the posters she had half-heartedly taped to the walls were still there, curling at the edges. It felt like stepping into a snapshot of herself, a version she wasn't sure she wanted to meet again. Alya sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on the worn quilt. The familiarity of the room was both a comfort and a reminder of how far she tried to run from it. She looked over at the desk, where an old photo sat propped up in a cheap frame. It was of her and her mother, taken on a summer day long enough ago that Alya couldn't quite place it. They were both smiling, her mother's arm draped casually over her shoulders. She picked it up, tracing the edges of the frame with her thumb. Her mother appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "I didn't want to throw it out," she said softly, her voice almost an apology. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you had," Alya said, setting the photo back down. "I haven't exactly been." "Don't," her mother interrupted gently. "You're here now." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it felt like something close to it, a small opening in the walls they had both built over the years. Alya nodded, her throat tight, and looked out the window, where the faint glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet street below. She didn't know how long she'd stay, or what she was hoping to find by coming back, but for the first time in a long time, the weight she carried felt just a little bit lighter. And for now, that was enough. When I first met Liam, I was convinced he was the most boring human on the planet. Not just regular boring, but like beige wallpaper on a rainy day boring. It was at one of those mandatory work mixers where everyone pretends to be interested in each other's hobbies. I had just started a new job, and Liam was part of my team, so I was trying to make a good impression. He stood in the corner of the room like a poorly placed houseplant, sipping a soda water with lime, and nodding politely at anyone who tried to talk to him. No alcohol, no jokes, no personality. It was like talking to a spreadsheet in human form. I introduced myself with what I thought was a clever opening line about how these mixers were basically introvert torture chambers, but he just blinked at me and said, "I don't mind them." Not even a chuckle, just a flat, matter-of-fact answer. I walked away muttering to myself, well, he's definitely the life of no party. Over the next couple of weeks at work, I kept my interactions with Liam professional and minimal. He always seemed serious, hyper-focused, and almost robotically polite. I'd crack jokes in meetings, and while everyone else would at least give me a pity laugh, Liam would just stare at me like he was recalculating my value as a human being. One time, he corrected me on a minor detail during a presentation, and I remember thinking, great, we've got a human Wikipedia on our hands. He just seemed so rigid, so bland. Then came the day everything flipped. Our boss decided we needed some team-building activities, so we all got dragged into an escape room after work. I figured Liam would spend the whole time overanalyzing the clues or lecturing us on how we weren't approaching the puzzles efficiently. And at first, it looked like I was right. He was quiet, standing back while everyone else argued over what to do next. But then, out of nowhere, he cracked this completely deadpan joke about how if we failed, he'd claim he was just an NPC observing the chaos. It took me a second to process that he was joking, and when I did, I couldn't stop laughing. The delivery was so perfect, so dry, that it caught me completely off guard. It was like realizing a vending machine could do stand-up comedy. The rest of the escape room was like peeling back layers of an onion. Liam went from silent to sarcastic to downright goofy in a way I had never seen at work. He started pretending to narrate our escape like we were in some dramatic action movie trailer. In a world where deadlines are tight and teamwork is non-existent, one ragtag group dares to defy the odds. He was so into it that at one point, he literally climbed on a table to deliver a monologue about the tragic death of a puzzle piece we'd accidentally torn. I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. After that, I couldn't stop noticing how different he was outside of work. We'd bump into each other in the break room, and instead of the stiff nod I'd come to expect, he'd casually make some ridiculous comment about the coffee machine being haunted or start an absurd debate about which office chair would win in a fight. It was like someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly this guy was hilarious and weirdly charming. One day, We got assigned to work late on a project together, and I was dreading the awkward silence I assumed was coming. Instead, Liam showed up with a playlist he'd made called Productivity Jams that included everything from classical piano to early 2000s pop punk. When I teased him about it, he admitted he didn't actually like most of the songs. He just wanted to see how long it would take me to notice the chaos. That night, we ended up talking for hours, not just about work but about everything. Turns out, he's a total nerd who loves sci-fi novels, has a cat named Spock, and secretly bakes elaborate cakes when he's stressed. At one point, I was laughing so hard I had tears streaming down my face, and I realized, oh no, I'm in trouble. The more I got to know Liam, the more I started to see the little things I'd missed before. Like how he always remembered everyone's coffee orders and would quietly leave an extra cup on someone's desk if they were having a rough day. Or how he'd stay late to help newer team members without making a big deal about it. He had this way of making people feel seen, even if he wasn't the loudest or flashiest person in the room. And don't get me started on his sense of humor. It was subtle, sure, but once you tuned into it, it was like finding the secret menu at your favorite restaurant, completely worth it. Fast forward a few months, and we're officially dating. The first time I brought him to meet my friends, they were all like, wait, this is the guy you said was boring? Are we talking about the same person? And honestly, I don't blame them. If you told me back at that first mixer that Liam would be the guy making me laugh until my stomach hurt or baking me a ridiculously intricate Totoro cake for my birthday, I'd have told you to lay off the office wine. But here we are, and I'm still in awe of how completely and hilariously wrong I was about him. Have you ever been totally wrong about someone at first? I'll never forget the day I learned that sometimes life doesn't just nudge you toward the right path. It yanks you by the collar, shakes you up, and sends you stumbling in a direction you never planned. It all started with a car. Specifically, my 2007 Honda Accord, the kind of car that says, this person has given up on impressing people and is just trying to get places without breaking down. Reliable. Boring. Perfect for a creature of habit like me. One Wednesday morning, I was rushing to work, already late because I'd hit snooze one too many times. I hopped into my trusty Accord, coffee thermos in hand, and turned the key. Nothing. Not even the sluggish whir of a dying battery, just dead silence. I gave the steering wheel a few encouraging pats, which, as you probably guessed, did absolutely nothing. So I did what any responsible adult does when their car won't start. I cursed, kicked the tire, and called my dad. My dad, who lives 5 hours away and was probably chuckling in his recliner with a cup of coffee, calmly suggested I call roadside assistance. I didn't have roadside assistance. Of course, I didn't. But I wasn't about to admit that, so I thanked him, hung up, and pulled out my phone to search for a tow truck. That's when I realized my phone was at 8%. No charger in the car. Naturally, this was the kind of situation where everything feels like it's snowballing. So I had two options, panic or walk it off. I decided to walk it off, hoping the movement would somehow jumpstart my brain and magically present me with a solution. Spoiler, it didn't. But as I was trudging down the sidewalk, I passed an old garage I'd never noticed before, tucked between a laundromat and a donut shop. It had that "this place has seen some things" vibe, faded signage, a pile of tires out front, and an owner who looked like he knew more about cars than anyone has a right to. The guy was standing outside, sipping a coffee, so I swallowed my pride and asked if he knew anything about dead cars. He grinned, took a long sip of his coffee, and said, "What's it doing?" I explained the whole absolutely nothing situation. Without a word, he grabbed his toolbox, followed me back to my car, and popped the hood. He tinkered for about 5 minutes before stepping back, wiping his hands on a rag and saying, "You got a dead alternator, kid. She's not gonna run until that's fixed." I braced myself for the bad news, the tow, the cost of the repair, the endless hassle. Instead, the guy said, "I'll tow it to the shop and fix it up. You just buy me lunch while I work." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious or about to rob me. But something about his easy smile made me trust him, so I agreed. Back at the garage, he had my car up and running in less than 2 hours. Over lunch, his choice, a cheeseburger with extra pickles and a side of onion rings. I learned his name was Joe. He'd been running that garage for 30 years, and he didn't take life too seriously. Cars are just cars, he said between bites. People? People are what matter. Never forget that. When I handed him a wad of cash, he waved me off and said, "Nah, you paid me. Cheeseburger counts." I protested, but he shook his head. "Here's the deal," he said. "When you see someone stranded or stuck, help them out. Pay it forward. That's how we keep the world turning." I drove away that day feeling lighter than I had in months, but I didn't fully get it until a couple of months later. I was heading home from work when I saw a woman standing by the side of the road, holding a flat tire and looking like she was on the verge of tears. I had somewhere to be, but Joe's voice popped into my head. People are what matter. I pulled over, offered to help, and somehow managed to replace the tire without dropping the car on my foot. She thanked me about 100 times, and as I drove off, I felt this strange warmth in my chest. It wasn't just about fixing a tire. It was about knowing I'd turned her day around, the way Joe had turned mine. Now, whenever life gets chaotic, I try to remember Joe's lesson. It's not about fixing cars or tires, or even saving the day. It's about showing up for people, especially when they least expect it. That one small gesture, an act of kindness, a moment of patience, can ripple out in ways you might never see. It's humbling, really, to realize how much we all depend on each other, even strangers. So, what about you? Has anyone ever stepped up for you in an unexpected way? Or have you had a moment where you decided to pay it forward? I'd love to hear your stories. I learned something big about life the day I got stuck on a roof. Now, before you start imagining some cinematic rooftop chase scene or a high-stakes heist gone wrong, let me assure you it was much dumber than that. I wasn't being adventurous or brave, or even remotely smart. No, I was on the roof because I had locked myself out of my apartment, and it seemed like the only logical way to get back in. You know how bad decisions feel totally brilliant until about 5 seconds after you've made them? Yeah, that was me. It started on a Sunday morning. I'd planned a lazy day, coffee, pajamas, zero obligations. Around 10 a.m., I realized I'd left my favorite mug in the car, and because I'm the kind of person who needs their coffee ritual to feel complete, I threw on some flip-flops and shuffled outside to grab it. No keys, no phone, no brain apparently, because as I grabbed the mug and turned back, I heard the unmistakable click of my apartment door locking behind me. I stood there for a solid minute, mug in hand, staring at the door like it might apologize and unlock itself. When it didn't, I tried jiggling the handle, classic, and patting my pockets as if I might have spontaneously grown a spare key. Nada. My landlord was out of town, and my only spare key was sitting inside on the counter, mocking me. I probably should have called someone for help, but my phone was also inside. So, I did what any overconfident millennial raised on problem-solving video games would do. I improvised. My apartment was on the second floor of an old building, and I remembered that the bathroom window was usually unlocked. The problem? It faced the alley, which meant I'd need to get on the roof to reach it. Now, here's where things get questionable. My neighbor, a retired carpenter named Stan, had this rickety old ladder leaning against his garage. I figured if I could borrow it and climb onto the garage roof, I could hop over to the fire escape and shimmy my way to the bathroom window. Easy, right? What could possibly go wrong? Stan wasn't home, but the ladder was there, practically inviting me to make a terrible decision. It creaked ominously as I climbed, and I remember thinking, if this thing collapses, I'm going to be that idiot in the ER who has to explain that they fell off a ladder while breaking into their own apartment. But it held, and I made it onto the garage roof. From there, I hopped onto the fire escape, which, in hindsight, was even more of a gamble. It wobbled under my weight like it hadn't been used since the Nixon administration. At this point, my heart was pounding, but I was committed. The bathroom window was right there. All I had to do was climb through it, and everything would be fine. Except it wasn't. As I leaned over to open the window, I heard a loud metallic clang behind me. I whipped around and saw that the ladder I'd used had tipped over, just toppled like it had given up on life. The only way down now was through my apartment. Cool, no pressure, I muttered to myself as I tried to push the window open. And that's when I realized the window wasn't unlocked. It was stuck. So there I was, stranded on a roof in flip-flops, clutching an empty coffee mug. and seriously questioning every decision I'd made that morning. For about 5 minutes, I just sat there, trying to figure out my next move. Calling for help wasn't an option because the alley was empty, and shouting, "Help!" I locked myself out. Didn't seem like the kind of thing that inspires swift heroics. I considered waiting it out until someone noticed me, but the sun was already baking the roof, and I had a growing suspicion that no one would think, "Hey, I should definitely help that guy sitting on a roof with a coffee mug." Then, salvation came in the form of Sheila, my downstairs neighbor, who walked into the alley with her tiny, yappy dog. When she spotted me, she froze. "What the hell are you doing up there?" she called. I tried to explain, but it's hard to sound dignified when you're on a roof barefoot and sweating like a criminal mid-heist. Sheila sighed and muttered something about idiots these days. But bless her heart, she went inside, grabbed her phone, and called a locksmith for me. The locksmith showed up about 30 minutes later, and by then, Sheila had recruited another neighbor, this teenager named Chloe, who was eating a popsicle and live-streaming my humiliation to her followers. "Dude, you're like Spider-Man, but sad," she said between bites. When the locksmith finally opened my door, I climbed back down, thanked Sheila profusely, and tried to salvage what little dignity I had left. But the best part came later that evening when I found a note taped to my door. It was from Stan. It said, "Saw you using my ladder. Next time, just ask. P.S. Glad you didn't break your neck." The whole fiasco taught me a valuable lesson, though not the one you'd expect. Sure, I could say it's about being prepared or not acting impulsively, but really it was this. People are more willing to help than we give them credit for. Whether it's a cranky neighbor, a surly locksmith, or a teenager with a popsicle, folks tend to show up when you need them, even if they make fun of you along the way. So, have you ever gotten yourself into a mess so ridiculous that strangers had to step in and save you? I'd love to hear about it, especially if it makes me feel less alone in my rooftop shame. It was supposed to be a quick trip to the hardware store. I needed duct tape and some nails to fix a wobbly chair, nothing exciting. The kind of errand you forget 10 minutes after it's done, but that day had other plans. It started when I couldn't find parking near the store and had to leave my car a few blocks away, in front of an old, slightly run-down bookshop that I'd never noticed before. The sign above the door read, "Morgan's Curiosities," and the window display was a chaotic mix of vintage books, a taxidermy owl, and a violin missing half its strings. It looked like the sort of place you'd pass by without a second thought, but for some reason, I felt drawn to it. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me first. A mix of old paper, lavender, and something faintly metallic. The store was larger than it looked from the outside. Its walls lined with shelves that reached up to the ceiling, every inch crammed with books and trinkets. There was no one at the counter, just a small bell that looked like it hadn't been rung in decades. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers over leather-bound spines and wooden carvings, each tagged with scrawled handwriting that hinted at strange origins. Recovered from the ruins of a seaside chapel, belonged to a Victorian stage magician, possibly cursed, handle with care. It felt like stepping into another world, one where reality bent just slightly at the edges. At the back of the shop, I found a narrow staircase leading down to what looked like a basement. A handwritten sign taped to the banister read, "Curiosities below." Normally, I'd never venture into some random basement, but the air in that place had a magnetic quality, like it was daring me to keep going. So, I did. The basement was dimly lit, with more shelves crammed full of objects that defied description. A globe with no recognizable continents. A glass jar filled with what looked like shimmering, liquid gold. A typewriter with keys labeled in a language I couldn't read. As I was taking it all in, a low, gravelly voice startled me. "Found anything interesting?" I turned to see an elderly man sitting behind a desk I hadn't noticed before, his face partially hidden by the brim of a wide hat. His voice didn't match his expression. It had sounded gruff, but his eyes were warm, almost amused. "Just looking," I said awkwardly, feeling like I'd been caught trespassing. He waved a hand dismissively. "That's what this place is for." He gestured toward a small table near the desk, where a cluster of objects was arranged haphazardly. A pocket watch, a wooden figurine of a fox, a deck of cards, and a small glass vial filled with something black and swirling. "Pick one," he said. "On the house." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of gimmick. "Why?" I asked. He just shrugged. "Sometimes, things find the people they're meant for." Something about the way he said it made me stop questioning. I hesitated before picking up the pocket watch. It was heavy and cool in my hand, its cover engraved with an intricate pattern of stars and moons. The old man smiled faintly. "Good choice," he said, but when I looked up to thank him, he was gone. The desk, the chair, even the table with the objects, gone, as if they'd never been there. I stumbled back upstairs, disoriented. The shop was empty now, the lights dimmer than before. When I stepped outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights were just starting to flicker on. I was sure I'd only been in there for 20 minutes at most, but my phone said it was nearly 8 o'clock. My hardware store errand would have to wait. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the watch felt warm in my pocket, almost like it was alive. When I pulled it out, the hands weren't moving, but the engraved stars seemed to shimmer faintly in the streetlight. A chill ran down my spine, though not in an unpleasant way. I couldn't explain it, but the watch felt important. I didn't think much about it until the next morning, when I woke up to find the watch on my bedside table, even though I was sure I'd left it in my coat pocket. That alone would have been strange enough, but the time it showed, 7:12, wasn't just frozen. It was glowing faintly, and as I watched, the hands started moving backward. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then my phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Ellie, asking if I wanted to grab coffee. She never texted me in the mornings. She always slept in on Saturdays. Something about the message felt oddly specific, as if I was supposed to say yes. So I did. We met at our usual spot, but as soon as I sat down, I noticed a man sitting alone at the next table, fiddling with a camera. He looked frustrated, muttering to himself as he flipped through photos on the screen. Ellie noticed me staring and whispered, "He's been here for hours. Keeps saying he's lost something important." Without really thinking, I leaned over and asked him what he was looking for. He glanced up, startled, then sighed. "I was taking photos downtown yesterday and accidentally deleted the best shot I've ever taken. It was perfect. The light, the angle, everything. Gone." Something clicked in my mind. "What time did you take it?" I asked. He frowned, but after a moment, he said, "Around 7:12, I think." I pulled out the watch and set it on the table between us. "Try again," I said, not entirely sure why. The moment he touched it, the air seemed to shift, like a static charge building around us. He picked up his camera, and his eyes widened. "It's back," he whispered, showing me the screen. There it was, a photo of a sunset over the city skyline, so vivid it almost looked like a painting. Ellie and I exchanged a look, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Whatever was happening, it was just the beginning. By the end of the day, we'd met 2 more strangers who, for reasons I still can't explain, were somehow connected to that pocket watch. Each encounter felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place, forming a picture that wasn't quite clear yet, but was undeniably magical. I still have the watch. I don't know why it chose me or what its purpose is, but every now and then, I catch its hands moving backward, and I know another adventure is waiting. Have you ever had a regular day suddenly turn into an unforgettable adventure?